That involves all kinds of like things about moving your life forward. And they struggle with
motivation in these things.
It's because when I don't think I'm worth it, I'm not worth fixing.
I'm going to go here. Okay. I don't know if I'm live or not, chat. Okay, was just buffering. We're good now. Okay, I think we're live on Twitch and YouTube.
Yeah, we're live.
Tech Teller, can you confirm?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. So I think we're set. I'm going to hang this up.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Tech. All right. Doug, I know you're here. We're going to shoot through our intro again. So sorry, guys, for our technical problems. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Dr. Alo Kanoja. Just a reminder that everything we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. If y'all have a medical question or concern, please go see a licensed professional. So sorry for the mix-up. I know we're starting stream 20 minutes late because we had some technical difficulties. I still don't know what happened. You would think that since we do this on a regular basis and we don't touch any of the settings, if you hit the go live button, it should go live. But I don't know if it's the curse of the internet gods or my general incompetence or what, or if it's just the nature of the business, but we're here now. So we just a couple of quick announcements before we hop into our interview. So today we're going to be talking with Doug Bopst. Did I say that right, Doug? They can hear you. Okay, awesome. So Doug is the host of the podcast, The Adversity Advantage, and a super awesome guy. I was lucky enough to be a guest on the podcast a couple of weeks or months ago. And Doug, we just totally vibed. So we wanted to hear more about his story. I think a lot of the work that he does and what he focuses on, I think is incredibly relevant to our community. So we're going to hop into that interview in a minute. We're rescheduling the autism deep dive stream. I got a little bit sick, so we'll focus on that at some point in the future. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Mark Comrade, who's an expert in helping loved ones get mental health support. So we frequently hear, stories from our community about like, hey, I have a spouse or husband or brother or daughter or friend who probably like needs mental health help. How do I convince them to go? And so Dr. Comrade is an expert in that, amongst other things, and we're super excited about that. Last thing to think a little bit about is we have a couple of cool memberships lectures coming up. So this month we're doing memberships, Emotions 201, and a deep dive into intuition. The topics for these lectures are actually selected by y'all. So every month people will vote on what lectures they want, and we prepare 4 lectures a month that are a little bit deeper in nature. So everyone loved Emotions 101, so we're doing Emotions 201. And then we also did, for example, 3 lectures on attachment theory because people wanted to understand like relationships. And if I have anxious attachment, what do I do? If I'm dating someone with avoidant attachment, what do I do? So it's a lot of fun. And if y'all are interested in deeper dives into stuff, definitely check it out. We'll continue to do deep dives here on the main channel as well. Like, so we had to reschedule our autism deep dive. So, status quo here on the channel. Sorry for being late. We're going to hop right in with Doug. Give me a second, Doug. All right. Thank you for your patience, my friend. Okay.
You got it.
So everyone meet Doug. Doug, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and tell us a little bit about the Adversity Advantage podcast?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me on. It's great to connect again. My audience really loved
the interview that you and I did on my show. So like you mentioned, I host the Adversity Advantage podcast. I'm also a former felon turned personal trainer, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I've been in recovery from drug addiction for over 15 years. I was hardcore addicted to Oxycontin, cocaine. I was selling a bunch of weed, also addicted to weed when I was a kid. I'm a motivational speaker and a 3-time author, and just somebody who just loves to help other people transform their lives.
Cool. And so what kind of stuff do y'all tell us about the podcast?
So the podcast really stemmed from my own story because as a kid, I used adversity to my complete disadvantage. So adversity for me looked like my parents getting divorced when I was 5. I was bullied a lot in school, loved sports, but wasn't good at them. Didn't get attention from the girls that I was attracted to as a kid. Just had a lot of mental health issues.
One of us.
Yeah. And so what ended up happening was I would numb a lot of that pain with substances. And so the podcast, is essentially the guide of what to do instead. It's really to help people navigate various forms of adversities in their life, including mental health, addiction, relationships, neuroscience, mindset. And so I interview people who have pretty amazing stories to talk about how they've used adversity to their advantage and turned a lot of pain in their life into purpose. But then I also bring on some of the top subject matter experts in the world like yourself to get into the science and talk about talk in depth about like the tips and tactics that people can use to navigate, various forms of trials and tribulations in their lives.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed being a guest on your podcast just because I think like you're fun to talk to. Like I think you bring so much to the table in terms of your own experience. And a lot of times when I'm a guest somewhere, I get like sort of the generic same questions like, oh, like explain this, explain this neuroscience, or what do you think are the 3 rules to do this? And I really appreciated that, a lot of your questions I think were informed by your personal journey. And I think that perspective that you bring changes what you get out of your guests. And I really enjoyed being it. I'd strongly recommend everyone check it out. If you feel like Doug is one of us, he has a podcast dedicated to, talking about this kind of stuff. And were there particular things, Doug, that you wanted to talk about today? Give me just a second.
I mean, I'm just here to serve and provide value to your audience. I mean, I'd love to share my story and talk about like why like turning to substances and external validation and the wrong things can present such a problem in people's lives, and essentially like what the other path is like and how people can actually healthily cope with mental health, with addiction, with stuff that comes up in their lives, and just really also provide like a message of hope for people, because I know there's a lot of people that follow you. There's a lot of people that are listening to this or watching this that just feel like stuck in life. Yeah. They feel like hopeless, like they're on the path maybe of transformation, but they're like, well, I don't know if I'm actually going to get to the place that I want to get to. Or they're like, if I keep doing these things, will I actually get there? Or they're at a place where they're like, you know what, like I've tried time and time again to change my life and I haven't been able to. So what's to say that this time's actually going to work? So I'm here to provide value in whatever direction you think would best serve.
So why don't you just tell us? I mean, so it sounds like you struggled a lot with, or not you struggled a lot. So it sounds like your parents were divorced at a young age. So I think you hit like all the big button issues. Yeah. So, and then you also said you were addicted to weed.
Yeah.
Now, some people like don't think you can get addicted to weed.
Huh? Really?
Yeah. I mean, what do you think about that?
I mean, obviously, like I'm only speaking from my own personal experience, but I mean, I did do a cannabis series on the podcast where I interviewed some of the top experts in the world on marijuana. So I think people should go check that out, where we talked about like what weed actually does to your mental health and why it can be so damaging. From my own personal experience, I think it got me used to checking out of life with something external. It got me addicted to chasing numbing pain. It got me addicted to escaping my problems. And so for me, like I said, my parents got divorced when I was 5. I was picked on a lot as a kid, and I had this massive weight on my back of what's wrong with me? Why don't my parents get along? Why am I not fitting into the friend groups that I wanted to? Why am I not getting along with certain people? Why aren't I good at sports? And I saw like the quote unquote cool kids like smoking weed after school. So I was like, oh, like if I do this, maybe I'll be cool. Maybe I'll fit into that box that I wanted to fit into. And one of my friends, after school, I was about 14 years old, gave me a little bit of weed to smoke, and the feeling I got was like life changing. Like I literally felt that massive weight come off my back, where I didn't have to worry about what my parents' relationship was going to be like. I didn't have to worry about what school was going to be like the next day. I didn't have to worry about my problems, my anxieties, my fears. Like it was all, just subsided by taking weed. And so that led to me.
Can I jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds great, man. So working with people who are addicted to weed, I think one of the things that I think is just the the hardest thing that I've had to treat, in my opinion, maybe it's just my lack of skill in this particular area, is when I work with people with weed, they describe exactly what you describe, which is actually not like euphoria. I mean, sometimes it can do that too. Like, interestingly enough, those people don't get as addicted. It's the people who get to feel normal. It's like you're living this life of like, I'm a loser. I don't know how to fit in. I'm getting bullied. Like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I don't know how to fix it.
Right.
And then you get high, and then suddenly you get to be like everyone else. It's not an addiction to euphoria. It's addiction to normality.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I mean, I was just, because you make quite a strong case for using weed. All of my burdens go away.
Right. But the problem becomes, it's like a dog chasing its own tail. It's like you don't get that same initial feeling ever again, in my experience, and from the people that I've talked to. So now that one hit turns into two, turns into three, now you're smoking a gram every day. Now you're smoking an eighth every day. Now you're smoking a quarter every day. And you're starting to just create more problems in your life because of what weed does to you downstream. And then, at least for me, like what I always tell people is like, listen, I'm not the pot police. Like if you're using it and it's legal and it's healthy for you and it's not destroying your life, like who am I to tell somebody what to do? However, for people who have a lot of trauma, for people who can't self-regulate, for people who can't deal with their problems in their lives, it's a really slippery slope, because it's like, what's next? Like I could only get so high off of weed to escape myself. So what was next? Well, what was next was then selling weed to get now a massive adrenaline rush on people needing me, making money, feeling cool, meeting other people that were selling drugs. Then it was like, well, what's next from there? Then it's cocaine. What's next from there? Then it's Oxycontin. And then the story goes on.
So I'm kind of curious. Is it okay if I kind of interrupt you? I mean,
oh yeah.
Okay, so you kind of said the downstream effects of
right.
weed. So because there's like a big debate, like I see these debates like with people in like meditation communities, and they're like, hey, is it okay to get high and meditate? Now even just clinically, right? So we have studies that show. I'm actually working on a lecture on. We have several lectures about the downsides of weed, but we've never done a lecture on the upsides of weed. And
right.
now if we want to be like scientifically valid, there are studies that show that. So for example, like clinically, I've used it a handful of times, or not me like I have had patients who have incorporated marijuana use into their clinical treatment with some good outcomes. So I think, there's strong evidence that shows that marijuana can actually be used to reduce your opiate dependence. So that's like something where it's kind of like the lesser of two evils. So what is that downstream? What are the downstream effects? Because here I am hearing about, sure, like there's an escalation of use. You're always chasing that first high, and you're never going to get it back. What are those downstream effects that you've kind of seen yourself or with the people that you've worked with?
Well, I think psychosis now with today's stuff. I think from one of the biggest takeaways from the series I did is that the weed, and I'm talking about THC. I'm not talking about CBD. I'm talking that the weed today is like way different than the weed that I was selling and smoking when I was growing up, and the THC content is way higher, and kids are using it younger, and it's like stunting their emotional growth, and people who are prone to psychological issues, it's causing psychosis and severe mental health disorders. I mean, as a trainer, part of my business and what I've done over the years is coached and trained people who trained like young adults who are experiencing mental health issues and addiction issues, because their parents will find me on the internet. They'll relate to my story and say, hey, can you help my son? You know, he really needs to turn his life around and get his health in order. He just, you know, went through blah, blah, blah. And over the last several years, I've had a handful of kids I've worked with that were in like the psych ward for weed, which was totally foreign to me, because when I was growing up, it was like, yeah, you got too high. Maybe you like ate too much. Maybe you like couldn't drive your car. Maybe you watched too much TV. There was no talk of people like going to rehab for weed or going into like a mental hospital for weed. Now, for me, one of the things it did, and I understand this happens in a small percentage of people, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is it created massive paranoia in me eventually. And I think it was because as somebody who was using weed, like I mean, I love the lifestyle of it. I love listening to the music. I love listening to like rap music and classic rock and a lot of the music that like really kind of emphasized drug use. Like I love the culture of that and the lifestyle, but what it did for me was like numb a lot of the pain that I described earlier. So as I was numbing all of this pain, I wasn't realizing that it was causing other problems in my life too. Like I wasn't going to work because I would rather smoke weed. I wasn't showing up to family events because I didn't want them to think I was high. And so with that said, I began a lot more.
Can I jump in there? So I appreciate that it sounds like, you know, I know you're a motivational speaker and you've shared your story before, but I think what we really resonate with is some of these details.
Yeah.
So like when you said, when I wasn't going to work to get high,
right.
Like I'm so curious about what goes through your mind when that happens. Like what were you thinking?
I mean, what I was thinking was, all right, I can go to work and make like $5 an hour or whatever I was going to make. Or my friends would like text me like, hey, you want to go get high and go to such and such park and go for a hike or go do this or go do that. And to me, like the idea of going to work where I was somebody who was scared of my own shadow was so overwhelming that I was like, oh, well, I can't really get high at work. I can't check out and feel normal. So I'm going to do the other thing. And I'm going to go.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said, because I think that really resonates, because I think it's like, because when you talk about it, right, as a story, you're like, oh, things were so bad because I was choosing to get high instead of going to work. But when we really look at your experience, going to work was not a good thing. You frame it like it's a good thing.
Well, I think society tells you, right, that you're supposed to like show up to work. You're supposed to keep a job. And I think that's true. Like, I think people who can't keep a job, they're going to struggle in life. Right. But
I completely,
sorry.
I completely agree. I think it's just really helpful to hear you talk about in your mind in that moment, like even listening to you. I don't want to go to your job.
No.
Right? It's like, what am I doing? Am I going to this fucking place and earning $5 an hour? And this is what I'm going to go to this place for 8 hours, be overwhelmed, be anxious, walk out of the door with $40 after a day of my time, or I can go out in nature and get high. Like that sounds like a no-brainer. Like it makes a lot of sense to me why you would do that. So how did you start to think that that wasn't the right choice?
Well, I just want to say one more thing. So as you're saying that, the other thing to consider is my home life wasn't good. Like my parents went through a really toxic divorce where they didn't speak to each other. They were constantly fighting for custody and stuff like that. And so I framed that because I also didn't want to be at home. So it was like, okay, my option is to go to work. But if I go to work, that means I got to come back home after work. I could somehow make up some story as to why I'm not going to work to my parents and then just go and be with my friends and go get high. And that seemed much more attractive to me given my home life.
Sure.
But for me, I really didn't understand the value of not doing drugs until I went to jail.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, as things progressed and I kept smoking weed, started to sell weed, started to do coke, like things happened in my life where you as a psychiatrist would be like, Doug, like, what the heck are you doing? Like, stop. Like, your life is falling apart. And the reason I say this is there was a point in my life where I was around like I think 17, 18 years old, crippling anxiety, like horrible anxiety, smoking a bunch of weed, selling weed, doing a bunch of coke. And there was one night where I was driving and I felt like I was having a heart attack. Like my chest or my heart was beating super fast. I had chest pains. My face was numb. I felt like I was literally dying. And at that point I had been to several of my friends' funerals because of substance related deaths. So I thought to myself,
you were 18 or 19 and you had been to several funerals?
Yeah, for people I hung out with. Oh yeah. Like I mean, it's crazy.
Bro,
it was a rough crowd, man.
I mean, what goes through your mind when you go to a funeral at the age of, like, what did you think was happening? How did you understand that?
It's hard. It's hard to understand because you're really not old enough to like value life in that sense, right? And you go and you're just thinking of it like, oh, like your buddy died who you were getting high with like yesterday, you know? And it's super sad because now it's like that person is no longer with you. I guess I wasn't like, oh, this is a wake up call for me to stop doing what I'm doing, because clearly I'm on the same path as these other people. It was more like I obviously am very sad for the death of this person, but I didn't understand it in the way I should. And frankly, like that happened a lot. Like I probably have like a dozen friends that died over the years.
Yeah,
people I hung out with, not just people I was friends with like on social media.
Doug, bro, like this is like I got to tunnel down into this if you're okay with it, because like it's so foreign, right? When I was 18, I would wake up in the morning, I would play StarCraft, then I would play Diablo 2, then I would play Warcraft 3, and then I'd go to bed, and then I'd wake up the next day, and I'd do it all over again. The people that I played with, I was not regularly going to funerals at the age of 18. Yeah. And I get that. I mean, I think a lot of what you said is incredibly powerful. Like, you didn't value life, right? Like, it sounds like it didn't feel like a big, like, and you weren't seeing things the way you should have. So what would go through your head when you would like go to the fourth funeral of the year?
I mean, it was kind of awkward because you would go there and a lot of the parents knew me and knew my friends. And so they had just lost their child, and it was obviously very painful and emotional for them. But in a way, like, you feel like you almost kind of contributed to it, and because we all hung out together, we all were making the same decisions. But it just seemed like my friends and I, that was just what we thought we were just being normal kids. Like, we thought it was normal to just get high all day, every day, listen to music, eat unhealthy food, and just think to ourselves like, oh, I think it's like, I remember there was the poster of the rock stars who all died. I think it was at 27 years old. And we like admired that. At people who died from drugs at 27, like, that was something we like almost aspired to. And we would often joke that if we couldn't party and get high, like, what was the point of even living? Like, I didn't think I was going to live to see my 25th birthday for that very reason, because I was like, I'm either going to end up like one of my friends in a casket, or if I get to that age where I have to quote unquote grow up, like, is life going to be fun anymore?
Wow.
And so my frame of mind, Dr. K, was just so different and so jaded. And maybe that's why I'm so passionate about like talking about things like the weed and everything, because I just saw the negative downstream effects it had on my life and my friends' lives as well. But bringing it back to that night, like, I ended up having those experiences, or that experience where I thought I was dying, drove to, and at this point, so just to paint more context of my family situation, again, I know you've talked on my podcast, like, it's hard to know like what is the weed actually doing to you, but I was acting out. I had a lot of mental health issues. I had a lot of behavioral stuff when I was a teenager. And as a result of that, I ended up getting kicked out of my mom's house when I was 16 years old. I had a party when she was in the hospital not too long before that, and then she busted me with a little bit of weed on my 16th birthday, and essentially didn't know what to do with me, and ended up sending me to go live with my dad full time, because at that point they had split custody 50-50, and changed schools, changed environments, changed living situations, all within 24 hours. And so I ended up, switching schools and barely graduating from high school there. And then my dad kicks me out right after I graduate high school.
So Doug, like, if it's okay with you, I mean, you gotta let me know, man. I want to slow it down, dude.
All right,
Like
let's slow it down.
you're skirting over things that I'm like, I'm blown, like my mind is blown. So like you said something to me and I was like, whoa. You were like, it starts with weed and then you go on to selling weed and then you go on to cocaine. And I'm like, whoa, dude, hold on. Like, how do you, like, what went through your mind? Is it okay? Like, if we slow things down a little bit, like,
Yeah. I'm just kind of just going with, I'm just trying to like kind of, answer the question in the best way possible while also like allowing you to pick apart. Like,
I think you're doing a great job. And let me know if it's like, if I'm interrupting you too much or whatever. But I think that like what I love about your story is not the events. It's like the experiences that led to the events. Because that's what people actually deal with, right? There's like, I guarantee you, I mean, I guess I can't technically, but statistically, there's no doubt in my mind that at least one person who's listening to this is a 16-year-old.
Right.
Who is thinking to themselves, like, I'd rather burn bright and burn fast. Like, I don't want to be a slow, like, burning candle. I want to be a firework. And if I die by the age of 25, like, whatever. Like, that's karma or whatever, right? There are people who are walking this path right now who aren't going to school, who are thinking to themselves, like, I'm spending so much money on weed. Like, why don't I start selling it?
Right.
And how do you get from weed to cocaine? Like, that's a pretty big jump, right? A lot of people just stay on weed.
Right. So where do you want me to start? You want me to start like what made me go from like possessing it to selling it? So what happened there was,
I just want to hold on a second, because nothing. I want to make sure that nothing we're discussing is going to get you into legal trouble, like statute of limitations, like all that kind of stuff. Is that a concern at all? Because we haven't talked about that ahead of time.
So I was arrested for selling drugs already, and I went to jail like over 15 years ago. Okay. So we're good.
All right. Yeah, I'd love to hear. I mean, how did you get to selling weed?
So, like I mentioned, like as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, you're making like $5 an hour or whatever at a job, and it's not a lot of money. Even if you're working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, it's still not a lot of money. And weed was expensive back then. To buy like a little bit of weed, like a gram was maybe like 20 or 30 bucks. I forget the exact amount. So as I started to build more of a tolerance and more of a habit, I began obviously spending more money on weed. And I couldn't ask my mom or my dad for money because they would ask me what I needed the money for. Yeah. And eventually, like I can't keep telling them I want to buy a new CD. You know what I mean? Yeah. Or I want to buy like a new pair of shoes. Eventually they're like, what are you doing? Right. So you figure out a way to essentially smoke for free. And what that looks like is if I was smoking a gram a day, I would buy 1/8 of an ounce and I would sell a couple of the grams in that 1/8. And then that would essentially cover
you'd have
the additional that I had, I could smoke for free. So that was like the goal with that. And then like also part of it, and I talk about this as being one of the hardest things for me was it gave me a reason to feel like wanted and loved and needed by other people, because I really didn't get that at home. And again, I'm not blaming my parents, and we have a great relationship now. I'm not blaming them for my problems, but that was the reality of my life at that point. And given the fact that I was also the kid who wanted to fit in with everybody when I was in school, I wanted to feel needed and loved by some level. And when I began to sell weed, even as I was selling it just to support my habit, I felt that, like I felt people calling me more and texting me, or not even, I don't think you could text them, but just reaching out to me, I guess I should say, and more in general, to want to spend time with me. And that felt good. And then I felt like I finally had some sense of power because people were now needing me for something that I had control over. Right. And so I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is kind of like addicting in a way in itself.
Yeah.
Right. And so then you progress with that. And I think like with anything, you start to graduate friends, you start to graduate levels in the drug game. So now, the kids that I was just recreationally getting high with, they weren't like of use to me, or we didn't have the same common interest anymore. So now I'm like meeting different people who are selling more weed, that's selling more weed that I can sell weed to. And then a lot of those people would introduce me to other people that had bigger quantities of weed or had things like cocaine and other drugs that I eventually, ended up getting introduced to. So that was like the initial phases of what led me into selling drugs. What got me really like hooked and in depth on just selling weed to make money was that I was a smart kid, like growing up. I mean, my decisions may not reflect that, but I did have aspirations to be a lawyer. I wanted to be, obviously everybody's like dream as a kid is to be an astronaut. That was like my thing. But then I sincerely wanted to be a lawyer and an FBI agent, and things like that. But I just didn't have the confidence to like feel like I could do that. And then my grades would also suffer in high school because I was skipping so much class to go and get high with my friends, that obviously played a part in my ability to pursue something like that. And then on top of that, my parents didn't have any money for college. So I began to like feel sorry for myself and blame them for my inability to go to school. And so as all that was happening, as I'm graduating high school, as I'm trying to figure out my life, as my friends are moving away, I got introduced to a guy that was a big drug dealer that one of my friends that used to live with one of my really close friends. And him and I had a meeting. He's like, hey man, like, what are you doing? I told him how I was not really going to go to school. I was going to go to community college and just kind of figure things out. But all of my other friends were doing something with their lives. And he was like, well, here's the deal with selling drugs. Here's the rules. Here's how much you'll get at a time, blah, blah, blah. And that's when I agreed to like just start selling weed to like make money. And that like opened up a whole new can of worms for me, because now it poured gasoline on the fire of me being able to feel needed and wanted. Because now I'm picking up pounds at a time. And now I'm like selling to a lot of people all across the state that I live in. And my phone was ringing off the hook. I had tons of text messages. Like people needed me and wanted me. And that became so addicting because it was an experience that I'd never felt before. Like I'd never felt that feeling before. And then it was when I started to do that was then you get introduced to people who are selling coke, right? Because now like it's kind of like, how sometimes like a lot of the bigger streamers, they all kind of know each other. You know what I mean? It's kind of the same thing with the drug dealing game. Like everybody kind of ends up knowing each other. And so, and yeah, man, and that's
It's
how
actually a scary analogy, man.
Well, I was just trying to relate it back because I know as somebody who's in the creative space, I know how it works. As you become more popular and you get bigger, you start to like get introduced and connected to people who are like at your level, right? So that was kind of what happened with the drug game.
Yeah, I once again, apologies for like I keep on interrupting your flow, but like I personally loved hearing that so much because I think there's a lot that we miss, right? So I remember when I was in residency, I would get a lecture about the addictive properties of marijuana. And the lecture was like, okay, if we look at marijuana, there isn't a physiologic withdrawal the same way that we have with like GABA receptors and alcohol and benzodiazepines. And like, it's different this way. There's a psychological addiction. There's not a physiologic addiction. But not a single educational piece that I've ever had in all of my medical training. I've never heard of someone talk about, like the reason I started selling drugs, what I loved about it is that someone cared about me for the first time. I became important. I became someone. People were hitting up my phone because they wanted me.
Right.
Right. And like that to me sounds, I mean, I don't even want to use the word addictive because that's like a basic human need. That's like satisfying hunger or thirst. We're not addicted to food. Human beings need to be, and it sounds like you were good at it because there are a lot of idiots who sell drugs.
Correct.
And you are a hustler. I think we kind of see that hustle, and you found for the first time in your life, like, and I've worked with people who have sold drugs too, and very similar, like very entrepreneurial. Like, I worked with someone who was in the Southwest, and this was before weed was legalized or decriminalized, and he made a lot of money. Like, he would find these like abandoned strip malls, and then he would set up like growing things in there. And then one day I asked him, I was like, why'd you stop? And he said, well, one day when I went in at night, there was a car in the parking lot. There's usually never a car in the parking lot. And then when I woke up, when I left in the morning, the car was still there. So I never went back. That's all it took.
Wow.
And I think these are the kinds of stories that, like, I think this is what I see clinically too. It's not just about dopamine and physiologic tolerance. And I'd love to hear more about some of the stuff that you said about, numbing the pain and stuff. But like, I think this is the real stuff. I'm hearing a kid who craved being wanted, being needed, having money, not asking your parents. The other thing that shocked me, which I'd love to hear a little bit about if you can extrapolate or share more, otherwise we can move on. But I'm also struck by how much your life started revolving around the marijuana. It's like, how do I get this for free? Right? That's the target. How do I stop needing to, and it's crazy. Like, you structured your life so that, okay, this is how much I have to sell in order to get this much. And that really sounds like a dependence to me.
Well, and the lifestyle of it, I think, became just as addictive, if not more addictive than the drug itself. And the reason I was like, I need to do whatever I can to get this is because of the numbing feeling that it gave me, and because I finally felt normal and then I could exist in my body for like the first time and since I could remember. And then I started to have more people want to be surrounded by me and want me in their life, that I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, now I actually have people that like me, like you said, that want me and that need me. And then I felt like I was cool because, again, like some of the people that I admired growing up, they did drugs. So I felt like I was on the path to becoming cool. But obviously it worked until it didn't work. And, I think one of the interesting things about my story, and you hear a lot of people who have recovered from addiction talk about this, is that I realize now in the work that I do that a lot of what I was doing growing up prepped me for doing this. Like the ability to like do everything possible to go after a drug to satisfy your human needs. It's like, now I have this never give up mentality when it comes to business, when it comes to life. Like, I have this whatever it takes mentality that I know has been ingrained in me from my days of addiction. The selling drugs aspect, like, I mean, I learned very early on about customer service and about building relationships, and whether or not that was like it was obviously the wrong way to do it, but those skills I think have translated a little bit in my ability to build a very successful personal training business and to build a successful podcast and what I'm doing now. And that's been one of the like real like keys to my transformation is accepting that part of my story is valuable, right? And the part that we kind of didn't really skip over, but I would love to kind of touch on, because I think as a psychiatrist you'll appreciate this, is that when I got kicked out of my house when I was 16, my mom's house and my dad's house when I was 17, I like was homeless for months. Like, I was like bouncing around from couch to couch, my friends' couches, like the summer after I graduated high school. Like, I didn't have a home. And those few months like taught me a lot about life.
What did you learn?
I just learned, like, as much as I didn't change in those moments, I was like, man, I don't want to live like this. Like, I'm sleeping on somebody's like hardwood floor. Like, I'm on a couch. Like, I'm waking up in the morning and people's parents they're looking at me like they like me, but I'm like, there's something inside of them. It's like, this guy is a complete screw up. Like, why is he on my couch? Where are his parents? Like, why is he like living on my couch? Right. Or the siblings of my friends that are looking at me. And I just felt so low. And the reason I bring that up is because early on in my transformation, which we can get to, I would think about those moments in my life. And I would think about that I never wanted to be in that position ever again because of the way that I felt and how low my self-esteem was, my self-worth, my outlook on life during those few months. Because I had realized like firsthand, like what it was like to not know, where my home was going to be. And what ended up happening was a close friend of mine who I had always, like, I was, as a kid, because my family was kind of broken, I became close with a lot of my friends' parents because they kind of, I saw them, they were together, they were fun, they would treat me well. And so I just became like attracted to that. And I developed a relationship with one of my close friends' parents, and they were like, hey, listen, like, I know you've been bouncing around from couch to couch. We want to give you like a more permanent place to stay until so-and-so goes off to college. but here's the rules. Like, and they laid out some rules, and I said, okay. And it's when I was living there that I had that moment that I told you about where I thought I was dying, and I was in my car, just incredibly, again, at a pretty low point in my life, high on drugs, experiencing all these crazy physical symptoms. And by the way, I was like a fat kid. I was like 40% body fat back then. So I did, in my mind, have some health issues that, even though I was young, I mean, I'm like, okay, I could be dying here. Ended up freaking out and driving right to my friend's house after I was experiencing these symptoms. And he had gone off to college at this point. It was like early fall, I think, late summer, early fall. And I walked in, I said, hey, I need to go to the emergency room. I think I'm dying. And of course, his mom looks at me like, what do you do? Like, what do you mean? Like, you're 17 years old. There's no way you're dying. And I'm like, I'm dying. I had no idea what panic attacks were. I had no idea what paranoia was, because I was told, like, oh, weed just chills you out. Like, that's what I was told. End up going to a local hospital. And of course, like, I look back now, I'm sure people were like looking at me like I was insane. I run into the ER. I'm like, help, I'm dying. And the nurses are like, sit down, like, you're not dying. Like, if you were dying, you couldn't scream like that. And they ended up right. They ended up like put me into a room, like checking my vitals. And they asked me, like, what drugs I was taking. I was honest with them because I was worried about my life at that point. And they were like, for what you just told me you're doing, like, your heart is pretty strong. Like, you are fine. You just had panic attacks. And I didn't know what that was. I was like, panic attacks? Like, what is that? And again, you would think in a moment like that I would say, okay, like the weed thing, the selling the drugs thing, like, it's been a good thing to help me feel normal. However, my life is falling. I'm in the emergency room at 17 years old, gone to several funerals, addicted to drugs. My friends are going to college. I'm not a good relationship with my family. Like, you would think, like, all right, Doug, like, it's time to give it up. But I was so addicted to that lifestyle. I then was like, well, how can I still find a way to get high with my friends without having a panic attack? Because what would happen, Dr. K, is I developed, you probably would know the term for it, not me, but I developed almost like a phobia where, because I had this massive panic attack and ended up in the emergency room, I then thought to myself, every time I smoke weed, I'm now going to have a panic attack. And what would happen? I would have a panic attack. So I would be like in my car with my friends, like shortly after this, riding around with them, getting high. And I would have to pull my car over and ask them to drive because I was freaking out and I was having a panic attack. And then eventually, after a few months of that, it became so embarrassing and uncomfortable that, fortunately, and also very unfortunately, one of my other friends gave me a 5 milligram Percocet just to try. And what I found was, when I did that 5 milligram Percocet when I was high, I didn't have the panic anymore. It took all that away. And I was like, oh, I found the thing that can allow me to continue this chaotic, addictive lifestyle that I've created for myself. And that was what really brought me to my knees, was opiates, because I justified it when I first started doing it. I was like, oh, it's man-made. It's a pharmaceutical. It's not heroin. I'm not putting a needle in my arm. Like, people get prescribed this stuff. So I'm doing the right. Well, but I want to also say, I knew I wasn't putting like spinach and protein in my system. You know what I mean? Like, I knew I was crushing up a pill and putting it up my nose, and I knew that somehow it wasn't going to end well. But I didn't realize how fast I would get addicted to those things. And so very quickly, and I'm talking over a period of like weeks and months, 5 milligrams turned into 10, turned into 20, turned into 40. And when I was doing these, I was doing the Oxycontin, like, brand name. It would say OC on one side and the milligram on the other side. So I was doing I started with like the 10 milligram, the 20 milligram, but eventually it was the 80 milligram pills that had a time release coating on them that were made for people, I think, who had like terminal cancer or something like that. And I would lick the time release off. I would lick the time release off, and then I would like shave them with a hose clamp to get it as fine as possible, and then I would snort them. And I was snorting, 400 or 500 milligrams a day.
That's got to be super expensive, man.
Oh, dude. Yeah. Super. But that's why, like, people always ask me like, "Oh, did you save any money selling drugs?" And I was like, "No, I was like using it to support another horrible habit."
Yeah. I mean, I want to say that a 30 milligram oxy, and by the way, everything you're describing, I mean, there's so much about what you're sharing that resonates with my experience. I think the psychosis is something. So when you said that, it actually, like, when you said like, oh yeah, marijuana induced psychosis, like that's the problem. And that scared me, honestly, Doug, because the reason that scares me is because I know that the majority of people who use marijuana don't have psychosis.
Right.
Right. So, and if we're saying like, oh, why is marijuana a problem? Like the first word out of your mouth is psychosis. And I cringed a little bit now because like now what's going to happen is there's like 80% of people out there who are not having psychosis. And I've seen it. Right. So I've been on the other end of the spectrum. That's why I appreciated that you're sharing so much more about this stuff. And I have so many more questions for you. But I mean, like, we see a lot of, or we saw a lot of K2 in Boston, if you're familiar with that. I don't know what else it's called elsewhere, but this is synthetic marijuana. So people will make like THC in a lab. It's not grown from a plant. And even when you have the marijuana actually has some pro-psychotic and pro-paranoia properties, and then it has some anxiolytic properties as well through like CBD and like anti-paranoia actually. But we're breeding for these more concentrated strains. And then what happens when people really develop a tolerance is they start taking K2. And if you take K2, it will mess you up so bad. I've seen such terrible, terrible lifelong consequences from using K2 a single time because you think that the devil is chasing you and you're on a 4th story and you're running down a hallway, and at the end of the hallway is a window and the devil is chasing you. And so what do? You jump through the window.
Right.
It's insane.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. And you just don't, I guess for me, I just didn't understand how addicted I would become to that lifestyle of my friends, of what we did on a daily basis, the music, I became so infatuated with all that because, like I said, it was like the first time in my life where I felt like I was normal. I felt like I fit in. I felt like there was meaning in my life. I felt like people liked me. But again, like I'm sure we'll also get into this. I mean, I found out that a lot of people like me for the wrong reasons because I had something
that they wanted.
That they wanted.
So is it okay if I go back and ask a couple questions about what you've shared so far? So first thing I'm curious about is like, what was going on like at home? Like, what did your parents think was going on? Like when you went to your friend's funeral, like what did people, because people must have known that, okay, if this person like OD'd and y'all were hanging out, then like y'all must like, how were people around you, including your parents, understanding what was going on in your life?
Well, I kept a lot of stuff from them. I mean, my mom obviously knew that I was experiencing some mental health stuff when I was living with her, and that was part of the reason. I mean, she didn't kick me out for having mental health issues, but I couldn't find a way to like manage it when I was a kid, and I was using weed as a way to cope and numb the pain. And because weed was like so stigmatized back then, I think, she thought that I was doing this horrific thing. And, it's funny, like today, like she'll ask me, she'll say, what's the one thing you wish I would have done differently? Because we have a very close relationship now. And I said, I just wish you would have asked me why. I said, because I was too afraid to like open up and share. As a man, I was like, if I share that I'm having anxiety right now, that I'm being picked on in school, this makes me look weak. This makes me look like I'm not a man. This makes me look less masculine, or whatever was going through my mind at the time. And so I wasn't really sharing like the deep stuff with my parents growing up. And my dad and I had more of a strained relationship growing up. I mean, we butted heads a lot. And he was the type of person that he kind of knew, if he knew something was going on, like he would kind of almost call the parents. Like that would be like one of the things he would want to do. So I wouldn't want to say anything to him because now
consequences.
Because now I could potentially be then made fun of for telling on people or being the reason that somebody found out that people were doing certain things. So I kept a lot of the things to the chest. I didn't like express myself to my parents growing up. Now they knew what I was doing. Both of my parents knew that I was using drugs to cope. They both knew that I was selling drugs, which is why they kicked me out, right? My mom kicked me out because she busted me with a little bit of weed. I was actually weighing out a little bit to sell to my neighbor. And then my dad kicked me out for essentially the same reason, where I was doing and selling drugs, and that wasn't allowed in his house. And so I ended up, being kicked out.
And do you have a sense of what your parents were communicating to each other at that point?
Yeah, I try not to I'll share. I try not to harp on this too much, only because, our relationship is great now. But I think just to provide context, like they didn't communicate. Like they did not like each other. It was all through like email or lawyers growing up. And that's how they talked to each other. Like there was no, hey, we're going to all meet together for the holidays, or we're going to all meet for coffee so I can see like what my parents are like together. Right. And so that was like one of the hardest things for me to unlearn, like as an adult, was like, because that mean they say modeling is everything. So all I saw was like conflict growing up. So like therapy really helped me through that as I got in my 20s. But going back to that, like, yeah, they didn't speak to each other. And it was weird because I was like, I knew that when people get divorced, there's a reason people get divorced. But I didn't understand. I was like, why don't they at least like, talk to each other?
Yeah.
It was kind of strange to me because they would see each other at like sporting events and they just still wouldn't speak to each other.
Yeah. I mean, I get the energy from you that, you're taking a lot of responsibility. You don't blame them. They're not bad people.
Well, I used to blame them a lot. And that's what I think got me into jail partially was I had this chip on my shoulder that because I had felt that my parents' divorce was so painful in my life and some of the other things that happened to me when I was a kid, I felt that could justify me behaving in whatever way I wanted to because the sob story sounded good.
Yeah,
like,
so
you know what I mean?
Doug, this is what's so challenging. When I hear you talk, and this is actually what I appreciate so much about you, and is that I think so much of what you're describing. When we hear the bullet points of your life, it sounds like you were an idiot.
Thanks.
And it sounds like the standard road down, not even paved with good intentions. It was like, but like the more that we get to hear this, I think actually you sound more and more reasonable to me. Like the more that you share about, like I just didn't, they got divorced when they were 5. They didn't talk to each other. I got bullied. I was a fat kid. I didn't have friends. And then now I'm making money. I'm not working. Like I can just, it appeals to me. Your life like resonates with what I remember I felt like, right? Like you just feel like a loser. And even the way that you paint this picture of I'm sleeping on a hardwood floor.
Yeah.
And it's like I've outlived my welcome on the couch. So I have to go to some place that really doesn't have space for me, but I have no other choice. I'm sleeping on a hardwood floor.
Right.
And then people, like, you can tell, like, I could feel it when I heard this story of, you wake up in the morning and these people are kind and they're compassionate, right? So they're not going to tell you, they're like, yeah, you can stay as long as you need to. But you can still see like the judgment in their eyes when like they're kind, they're good people, but they still look at you and they kind of see like they see a fuck up.
Yeah, exactly.
And you feel it.
Well, because there was a lot of kids that weren't allowed to hang out with me because I had such a reputation for doing drugs. Yeah, I was the kid that just couldn't figure out life and that was making all these wrong decisions and then was influencing, I guess, other people to make poor decisions. I appreciate your take on that. And I think like the reason I take so much responsibility for it now means twofold. A, like I've just learned as I've gotten older that people genuinely do the best that they can with the skills that they have in those moments. And B, like, because I blamed my parents for so many of my problems growing up, like it led me to validating doing all these other things because the story made sense, right? To me.
Yeah. Can I ask a couple questions about that?
Yeah.
So let's just like offer a clear disclaimer here that like sometimes when we talk about people's parents, like we make them seem bad, but it's very clear to me that your parents, as you said, did the best that they could given the hand that they were dealt, that you have a good relationship with them now. They seem to be like really solid human beings. So we're not trying to say anything negative about them. The crazy thing is that, this is what I'm so curious about because I understand exactly what you're saying. I think that you would kind of blame them for your problems. And when you blame them for your problems, you stop taking responsibility. And when
Right.
you stop taking responsibility, stuff gets worse.
Sure.
Super
Exactly.
simple.
Right.
At the same time, like working as a psychiatrist, when people come into my office who have a history of addiction, sometimes we do go down the very real reality of what's it like to grow up in a household where people don't get divorced early, where people don't talk to each other, where even when we get, there's so much impact of two parents sitting down with their child, even if they're divorced, and say, hey, this is so important that we're going to set aside our differences and we got to figure this out because you're spiraling.
Right.
And when that doesn't happen, that's incredibly hard to deal with as a kid.
For sure. Oh, for sure. But I mean, I also think like, I don't think I wanted to get better though. You know what I mean? Like, I think even if they had come to me, I don't think I really wanted to truly get better. And I'll tell you why. So if somebody had said, let's just say both my parents came to me and said, hey, Doug, like, we'll grant you 3 wishes. We'll give you whatever you want. The only thing you have to do is you're never allowed to do drugs again. My 3 wishes would have been, I want attention from pretty girls. I want a 6-pack and big biceps, and I want to make really good money. And I ended up getting those things in my early 20s, where I got to a place where I was super ripped. I was getting all kinds of attention from girls. I was making really, really good money. And I was still miserable because I hadn't done the actual like internal work to be happy with Doug. It was always like this external stuff that was needing to fill that void. Now, do I still care about my health? Of course. Do I still care about romantic relationships? Of course. Do I still care about being successful and having meaning, purpose? Yes. But it's not the end all be all for me. It's like, if I'm not happy with myself and the person I see in the mirror now, like, that's a problem to me because, right?
Absolutely, dude. I mean, I love this. So I'm kind of curious, like, so many questions. So what I'm curious is, like, how is that not the work? Right? So if we say, like, okay, I thought the work was getting ripped. I thought the work was making money, right? Isn't that the work?
It is the work with context. It's the work because I think I wouldn't have gotten ripped had I have not had those goals of like getting attention from girls or having a 6-pack or having big biceps or whatever. But that became my purpose and my identity. And that was like all I cared about at that point, was the way I looked. And because I was basing my self-worth on people's approval of me, I had to keep maintaining that physique because I thought if I didn't have that physique that nobody would like me. Same thing with the drugs. Like, if I stop selling weed, if I stop doing weed, then I'm going to lose the attention from all these people that are now in my life. So right?
Yeah. Sorry. Can I just, man, I feel like such a dick for keep interrupting.
Oh,
But I mean, there's so much wisdom here that I want to just make sure we have this right. So like,
Sure.
what I'm almost hearing is that the core problem was always there. And then drugs satisfied it in one way. Like, this is how you're getting attention. This is how people are liking you. And then you replace the drugs, presumably. I'm not quite sure the timeline, but with like getting ripped and making money and whatever. But it's almost like replacing one addiction with another, right?
Well,
it's still external validation.
Yeah. So when I went to jail, and I think this is an important time to bring this up, like, that's when I started working out, when I was 21 and I was incarcerated on felony drug charges. So, and again, you can pick apart this. I'm just going to give you like the bird's eye view of this part of the story to like kind of tie in what we were just talking about. So Cinco de Mayo, 2008, I was 20 years old. My life, all my bad choices kind of came to a head. I was riding around with a few of my friends to make a drug deal. I had a half a pound of pot in my trunk, a couple $1,000s of cash in the glove box. And a cop was running radar because it was like one of the biggest drinking nights of the year. And I decided, because I was so addicted to the lifestyle of drugs that if it didn't involve selling or doing drugs, like, I didn't want anything to do with it. And so I had a busted headlight that I had been meaning to fix for a while, but I just didn't because, again, it would have taken time away from my addiction. And so I ended up flashing my high beams at this police officer to think it would hide the fact that I had a busted headlight, but really it gave him a reason to pull me over. Yeah. So my heart, Dr. K, in this moment is like in the pit of my stomach. 'Cause I just knew I was like, I'm going to jail. Like, I know that I am riding
Screwed.
dirty. I know that like just stuff's going to happen. Pulls me over. I like stumble to get my license and registration out of my car. One thing leads to the next. He pulls me out of the car and searches it. And he finds everything. He finds the drugs. He finds a scale. He finds money. And I ended up getting booked and charged with possession. It was a felony, possession with the intent to distribute marijuana, and ended up going to jail for the night. Got bailed out the next day by my dad, and then throughout those next few months was like the legal process, getting arraigned, and then I had to go to circuit court, and so I end up going to court in September of 2008. Again, you can pick apart as much of this as you want. I just want to provide context.
Yeah.
And the judge, in my mind, I thought threw the book at me because, it was first time being arrested as an adult. He said, I'm convicting you of the felony drug charge. I'm sentencing you to 5 years in jail, but I'm suspending everything but 90 days, meaning that I had to do the 90-day sentence. And if I messed up, if I violated probation, if I got another charge, if I did anything to like go against what he told me, I could potentially go do the full 5 years. Then he gave me 5 years of probation, He gave me 5 years of probation, which was both, initially very supervised, then unsupervised. And then 200 hours community service, all kinds of fines and drug classes. But he said, Doug, listen, you're young. You're 20 years old. This felony conviction is going to haunt you for the rest of your life. He's like, I'll make you a deal. And I'm like, deal? I'm like, where's the deal? Like, I'm going to jail and I'm going to get the crap beaten out of me when I go to jail because I am fat. I have no self-confidence. Like, I'm the guy that's going to get picked on in there. And he's like, I'll make you a deal. He's like, if you complete everything without messing up, no missed probation appointments, you do your community service, you do all the things, I'll take the conviction off your record at the end of the 5 years. He's like, deal? And I'm like, of course. Like, yeah, deal. Like, what other option do I have? And so I end up reporting to jail a few weeks later. And I met my soon-to-be cellmate, who looked like a more jacked version of Brad Pitt from the movie Fight Club. And at that point, I was I mean, I was detoxing from Oxycontin the first few weeks I was in jail, but he looked, oh man, cold turkey. It was awful. So bad. I mean, it felt like having the worst case of the flu. And he looked at me and he's like, you're going to start working out with me when you get done your detox. Because he could just tell, like, I wasn't really meant to be there. He could just tell I didn't look like the type, right? And I was just like, whatever, man. I could have been a model for Pillsbury. I'm not going to be able to like work out with you. And so this conversation changed my life. This conversation ties in a lot of what we've talked about over the last 10 to 15 minutes or so. So as any good coach, therapist, doctor would do, he started asking me some good questions. He's like, Doug, like, what like led you to getting into jail? Like, what happened? And I started to blame my parents. I started to blame my friends, everybody else but me. And he looked at me and he just said, quit being a victim. And I was kind of shook because I was like, man, like, I just told this horrible story to him. Isn't he going to pat me on the back and say, it's okay, Dougie, like, the world's against you, like, blah, blah, blah. He's like, man, you're blaming everybody for your problems but yourself. He's like, you're taking zero responsibility here. He's like, there's plenty of people that grew up just like you that aren't in jail, right, Doug? And I'm like, yep. He's like, no one's coming to save you. He's like, no one's going to come and rescue you from your situation. He said, you have two choices. Be a man, look yourself in the mirror, take full accountability and say, you got yourself here, and it's up to you to change. Or you can go be a victim and cry in the corner and say, woe is me, and blame everybody else for your problems. He's like, most people will actually do that because it's easy to do. And it was in that moment that I decided to start working out and change the way I dealt with my anxiety and stress and all my problems. And it was also in that moment that I had realized like how destructive I was in my own life. Like, you were asking me, when was the moment that I realized that? It was when I was in jail, and I had this like come to Jesus moment where I was like, well, clearly I don't have everything figured out. Here I am, 21 years old. I had 21 jobs by that point, damaged relationships with my family, addicted to drugs, convicted felon, 40% body fat. I clearly didn't know what I was doing. So I was like, maybe I'll give this exercise thing a try.
I love the way that like you put those things together, right?
Yeah.
Convicted felon, 40% body fat.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I think it really speaks. I think this word gets tossed around a lot, not usually in stories like yours that involve drugs and jail, but this word gets tossed around in like yoga studios and yoga retreats. Holistic. This sounds holistic to me.
Yeah.
And honestly, Doug, I'm terrified, bro. I'm terrified because what scares me is that there's so many, what scares me is that this guy showed up, which we got to talk about him for a second, where he came from and what's going on here. I have so many questions about even what we do in the field of psychiatry, because I'm noticing this trend, especially in psychiatric training, where I've noticed, I was talking to some of my colleagues, and I sense a fragility in people now, where, you know, I think that there's a lot of like justified, like people are victims. You are a victim of your circumstance, and fair enough. Sure. Like these things are scientifically challenging. There are these things called adverse childhood experiences. I'm sure you're familiar with them. The more of them you have, the more prone you are to things like addiction. Really not your fault.
Right.
But there's a certain fragility that I'm noticing more. But what I really want to focus on is like, there's so many people in our community who haven't hit rock bottom,
right?
Who aren't stupid enough to hit rock bottom, right? Who are not quite as desperate. They're kind of stuck. Like you kind of said, you know, you advance through the ranks. You're like playing in the minor leagues, then you're playing in the major leagues, then you're at a top tier team. And that's what you did until you got busted. You went to jail. And then this guy was your cellmate.
Right.
And what I'm so terrified of is that when I see your turnaround, I see you accepting responsibility. But what I'm scared of is that there are so many people, and this is what I struggle with as a psychiatrist, rock bottom, like same thing happened to me. Like I'm not like rock bottom was different from me, but once again, I went to a different place where I was separated from, I detoxed in a sense, nothing nearly as bad as what you did. And I also met a guy who was kind and helped me look at myself and say, like, what are you doing? Like, how does this stuff work? But what I'm scared of is all the people who are not going to have those opportunities. What do they do? How do you walk this road without hitting rock bottom and having someone pull you up? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I have thoughts, and it's like, again, it's like, it's hard because I'm not in that experience. Like I often say that I got truly lucky to encounter my cellmate when I was in jail, because I didn't want to. It's not like I walked into jail and I was like, yeah, I'm going to use this as a time to change. I was like, I'm going in here, I'm doing my sentence. When I get out, I'm going to do the same thing. Right. But I think a lot of it kind of comes down to self-awareness. I know you talk about self-awareness a lot, and just asking yourself, like, what is it that you want, like in your life, like truly like getting on, like radically honest with yourself about what you want. And then like, what is the actions you're taking on a daily basis? Is that aligned with where you want to go in life? And it's hard because sometimes people are making these decisions that aren't inherently quote unquote bad, but it's preventing them from living the life that they want. And it's having these downstream effects on how they feel about themselves.
So I'm going to get contentious if that's okay.
Yeah.
So like, but I think the whole point of your story is that the things you were doing were moving your life in the way that you want. Right? You wanted validation. You wanted to be important. You wanted to be noticed. And drugs gave you all that. Right? That's what I struggle with, is that like, when I'm trying to help someone, I think they're moving in the wrong direction. But when I really am honest with myself about what their experience is like, it's like yours. Drugs are not a problem. They're a solution.
Yeah, but I think it was a solution for me in those moments, but I think what it did was it created tunnel vision where I was unaware of the other problems it was creating in my life, where it ended up not being the thing that I really wanted. Like after I was like, sleeping on my friends, floors that I talked about, like in those moments, I was thinking to myself, like I said, I don't want to live this way, but I had no other solution for that. There was no better solution at the time until I went to jail, and I was like, oh, I can work out and get a similar feeling to getting high. I can work out and build self-discipline. I can work out and feel better about myself and get comfortable with uncomfortable feelings and prove to myself I can do certain things, because that was something that I couldn't do when I was younger. I told myself I was a failure. I told myself that the only way to have success and be validated was through doing and selling drugs. Like that was the only path that I knew. So I understand what you're saying. And I think we talked about this on my show, and that, yeah, it's a great solution. Like it seems very valid to people. I think you were talking about weed and you were like, yeah, like weed for a lot of people, maybe it was alcohol, I forget which substance we were talking about, but you're like, yeah, it makes them feel more comfortable on dates. It makes them sleep better in the short term. It makes them like more sociable. It makes them like not have as much, stress in the short term, or whatever the examples were. Like, how do you convince people to stop that? Right. And I think it's tough, because I can sit here and I can say from my experience that problem or that solution works until it doesn't, because that's what happened in my story. And that you should do these things. You should work out. You should spend time with great people. You should have meaning and purpose in your life. You should take, full responsibility for your actions. You should have, hobbies. You should, do things that really like light you up. But to the person who is at like rock bottom or near rock bottom, or is like kind of unhappy in their life, that sounds so scary, right? Because then it's like, I have to let go of this thing that's been working for me for quite some time and go to this thing that I know may work, but it's going to take a long time for it to actually start working.
I mean,
right?
not just that. It's also that I think the other thing is that, I mean, yeah, I completely agree. And I think you'll agree with what I'm hearing this too, in between your words. And I think this is part of your message. It's not just that I have to abandon this thing. It's that I don't trust myself to make it to the other side. Right. That there's a solution over there that may work for some people, but I don't believe it's going to work for me because I'm not that good. I'm not that strong. I can't turn things around.
Well, and I think what it's common in people, at least that I've seen, who battle addiction, is that during the times where they're contemplating making a change, where they're like, all right, like this has been working for me, but I got to do something else. Like, what else is out there? Their self-esteem is shattered. So now you're taking away this massive solution and coping mechanism, tie in the fact that now their self-esteem and self-confidence is at near like rock bottom. Then their ability and belief in themselves to like make that change, it's like next to nothing.
Yeah. So what do you do for them?
I mean, I think you got to tell them, like, you at least have to try it, right? Like there's no greater place to be than when you want to make a change in your life and making that. I mean, and I think the if you were to ask me, like I can't like sit here and say, hey, this is like the blueprint, do these things. I would say there's like common themes that I think have helped a lot of people that I know. The first is to learn how to stack small wins, because and you would know more about what this does to the brain than me, but I know for people when they're looking to transform their lives, and I've seen this a lot in my career as a trainer, it's like, I want to lose 100 pounds. Well, it's like, why don't you just start with like getting off the couch and going for a walk, right? Or the person that wants to recover from addiction, they're like, I don't want to ever use drugs again. Well, why don't you just start with not using drugs for one day, right? Because I think what happens is you slowly start to build your self-confidence up from that point, right? Because you're proving to yourself that you're actually capable of doing things that you say you're going to do, and you're actually capable of making some positive change in the opposite direction. I think the second thing is you have to really develop a very deep emotional why as to why you want to make that change. Because I think the surface level stuff just doesn't work long term. I think if you're telling yourself, oh, I just want to lose the weight because I want to look a certain way, like in a shirt, or I want to build muscle because I want to look a certain way in clothes, it'll be great for like a month. But then after that, like when things get hard, like what do you fall back on? And so like for me, like I never wanted to be that kid who hated myself ever again. I never wanted to be the kid who had suicidal thoughts ever again. I never wanted to be the kid who was acting out and morphing myself into a version of myself I hated just to be liked. Right. So, I mean, that's like a few things I would tell somebody. I mean, it's tough because I don't want to sit here and just say, yeah, I think you should do exactly what I did. But what I've learned from the people that have transformed their life is that they have like focused on those things. They developed a really deep emotional why. They've started small. They haven't given up on themselves. And the other thing that I think is important too is like you have to choose your inner circle wisely, because if I think your environment creates a false sense of normalcy. Like if you are spending time with a bunch of people that are engaging in the same unhealthy behaviors you're trying to change, like you're gonna already think that's normal, and B, it's gonna be hard to get out of that when you're trying to change your life. So I always tell people to spend time with people that have common futures and not common pasts, and just really get on that mission of like, all right, here's where I want to go in my life. What types of people should I be spending time with, and kind of going from there.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. You even glossed over, I think, maybe one of the most profound statements I've heard all year, which is turn yourself into something you hate just to get people to like you or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I did. I mean, it was like the crazy, I had no identity of I didn't know what I liked anymore. I didn't know who I was. I didn't understand like my place in the world. And it was because I was like putting myself in all these different friend groups to try to get as much attention and validation as possible. And then you become like somebody you hate because you lose your sense of self. Like you have no idea who you are. You just start to like say whatever you think is going to get you attention from whatever person you're trying to get attention from.
I love it, dude. Yeah, we can talk about stacking small wins and the neuroscience and psychology of that maybe at the end if people are interested. But I mean, Doug, I love your story. I think it's like it's so. I think oftentimes we look at the events that make our life, but I don't think it's the events. I think it's our experience of those events.
Right.
And in that vein, what I'm so curious about is, you had a lot of people sending you the right signals for a long time, right? Including this judge, which I think this judge, like, I'm tempted to track this person. We shouldn't do this, right? Because that's doxing and whatnot. But like, I'm tempted to track this person down and send him a thank you letter.
Yeah.
Just like, well, I don't know.
I got to thank him in person because I did complete everything that he asked me to do. And I went back to court in January of 2014, and he took the conviction off my record.
Does he know what you're up to now?
I think so. Yeah. Because what happened is, this is crazy. Like, I mean, I really had no spiritual relationship like at all growing up, because I thought that if God was good and if God is about love, then why am I in the situation that I'm in? But I can save that story for another day. But what ended up happening was I became very successful as a personal trainer, and the Baltimore Sun, a local newspaper, had come and they wanted to do a story on me and who I like what college kids were doing for their workouts. And so they filmed me training a group of college kids for a bit, and then we're going to publish a story on it like sometime in the near future. And it just so happened that I was on the front page of the health and fitness section of the Baltimore Sun the day I went back to court. And so the attorney that was with me was like, Your Honor, like, I don't know, like, how else I can prove that this guy's changed his life. He's on the front page of the health and fitness section. And the judge kind of made a joke. He's like, I know you got your tricks, but I don't know how you pulled this off, as a joke. But he was just saying, beautiful. Like, he's like, this is a beautiful, he's like, I'm able to see like the power of what the judicial system is like meant to do. And obviously I know it's got its pitfalls like anything else, but he was like, this is like, I guess my hope is what this did for you. He's like, I'm really glad that you used that to your advantage. But yeah, it's just a crazy story, and how he helped me out. And obviously my grandparents, I should also say, were a huge like saving grace in my life. I mean, I lived with them after I had that panic attack. I went to the ER. I ended up moving in with them for a bit and kind of took advantage of them and didn't treat them well, and ended up leaving there and then living on my own for a bit. But then even when I got out of jail, they took me in and gave me a place to live and gave me a place to just rebuild my life. And I think this framework was very helpful with what they did. And I don't know if they were necessarily intentionally trying to do it this way. They said to me, like, listen, like the last time you lived here, it didn't work out. Here's the rules. You can live here. You don't have to pay us rent. We'll take care of your food. If you want to go out and have fun with your friends, we'll give you some spending money as long as you bring us receipts. You're going to make your bed every day. You're going to have a job, which is part of my requirements for being on probation anyway. You're going to work out, like all of these things. And they said, but the minute you violate these things, you're out. And so it was this great like balance of like accountability and love that I needed at that time, where it just allowed me to continue to build that self-discipline and self-accountability that was crucial for me to be able to inevitably change my life. But they had been people throughout, they've been there for me throughout the course of my life that were also like giving me signs to change. And even like there was people that I went to school with whose parents wouldn't let them hang out with me. Like that was a sign. Or people who, like girls who I was friends with that like begged me, like, please stop like selling drugs. You're such a better person than this. Like, please. Like I broke promise after promise to people because I was so addicted to that lifestyle. So, I mean, as much as I think my story is amazing and I'm really fortunate that it's helping so many people. I mean, I'm really thankful that I went through what I went through. And I think I got lucky, if I'm being honest. Like if I didn't have my cellmate, I don't know, I'd be dead. You know?
That's honestly what terrifies me.
Yeah.
Because I think I got lucky too. And what's scary to me, like as a psychiatrist, is I can do a lot in my office, but when I really talk to like even my patients, man, like a lot of it's like it scares me, dude. When I hear stories of transformation like yours, and I think it's beautiful, like when you talk about the adversity advantage, because so many people that we work with in our community, I work so hard at a video game. I wake up, I think about it, I analyze it, I practice, I'm serious about it, I'm climbing the ranks. Why can't I do this in real life?
Right. Yeah, and I think like the nature of the show isn't to necessarily tell people how to live their lives. It's to give people better ideas, because I thought that the only way to deal with adversity and pain was to make it go away as fast as possible and to avoid it, right, at all costs. And that came from me suppressing my emotions and not talking to people in my life about how I was truly feeling. And it also came with me using substances in a way that just completely numbed me from being able to feel feelings anymore. And one of the most powerful things that happened to me, and I've heard other people talk about this too, is when I learned to leverage the dark side of pain when I was in jail. So when I started to work out, I couldn't do a push-up for my knees. I couldn't do a push-up for my feet. I could barely walk up and down the steps because of how I described who I was. And also my stamina was horrible because I also was smoking a bunch of cigarettes. But I remember a couple of the guys in jail being like, you have to think about what makes you angry when you work out. And I never really understood what that meant. But once I understood what that meant, I was able to like connect to my emotions again and think about the stuff that pissed me off from back in the day, whether it was people that wronged me or the way I treated myself or whatever the example was. But in a weird way, it helped me process some of that stuff because I was able to like almost channel it into something constructive like fitness, which I know you're a big proponent of as well for people who are looking to change their lives. And I learned how to like reattach behavior to emotion in real time. Like I also thought I think I got lucky is because I was also in one of the scariest moments in my life is when I learned how I learned how to cope with my emotions was when I was like in it. Like I wasn't like reading like memes on Instagram, or I wasn't reading personal development books on like how to change my life. It was like survival. It was like, I know that if I act out in here, I'm going to get the crap beaten out of me. I'm going to end up in solitary confinement. I'm going to get more time. So I can't use these same tactics that I used before. So fitness and just practicing the pause, going for walks, learning how to like walk with a different swagger, just the way I talked to myself when I was in there, all those things became like instrumental, not only for my time to survive behind bars, but when I got out, when things got tough, because things were like the first few months after jail. I mean, learning how to deal with life all over again was tough. Like I wasn't confined anymore. I wasn't as protected, if you will. I had to like,
oh yeah,
if something happens now, like I could have gone and bought drugs. I could have gone and done certain things. And now I had choice again, right? I mean, legally I would have gotten into some trouble, but I still could have done that if I wanted to. And so it really forced me to dig deep and like figure out a way to deal with life in a way that was much healthier than before.
Do you have a sense of why you were more receptive to this cellmate than you talked about, these people calling you up and like and people tried to tell you like, what, because I think this is the other thing. We're talking about rock bottom and circumstances. But the other thing that I'm kind of noticing is that maybe the thing that we can control, because it sounds like the signals were actually always there.
Right.
It's your receptivity to them that changed.
I think it was the first time, I mean, at least in my realization, I had people that looked out for me. It was the first time I felt like somebody genuinely took interest in my life who had no skin in the game. Like he wasn't a family member. He wasn't a friend. Like he was just somebody I just randomly met. And I wanted what he had. Like, he was a seasoned, inmate. He had been in prison for a long time, but he was jacked. And I always wanted that, but I never thought that I could lose weight because I tried a couple times and never succeeded. So I was like, oh, this guy actually has it figured out. So in a way, I just was like, oh, I want to listen to this guy. He knows what he's doing. But I think it's like I just happened to be just ready. And I think I was ready because it was the first time I was like sober. There was no drugs in my system at that point. And I also had this realization that my life is a mess right now. And I have helped create this mess. And that if I keep on this path, I'm going to end up dead or in jail for life or whatever would have ended up happening to me. And I was like, man, I remember sitting in that cell and I just said, I wanted more for myself. Like I knew like deep down this kid was I knew I was a good person and that despite my actions, I was an intelligent kid. I knew I was great at like relationships as far as like how to network and build them throughout my drug dealing career. And I knew I just had this ability to connect with people and make people laugh. I was always a funny kid growing up, but I didn't know how to like do all that in a way that wasn't like attention seeking. You know what I mean? And so I was like, all right, like if I want more for myself and I want to make this change, like what happens if I give this exercise thing a try? And here's the other thing that was really important. Like I said, I was so concerned with how other people thought of me that I wanted to fit into every box. My biggest fear was that I was going to get down and do a push-up in front of all these grown men, and I was going to collapse because I knew I was fat and I wasn't going to be able to do one, and everybody was going to laugh at me. Because that was my idea. It was like, all right, if I'm showing weakness as a man, people are going to laugh because that's what kind of like what society in a way tells you, right? But the opposite thing happened where I went down, I collapsed. Nobody laughed. They were kind of almost like, come on, man, you can do it. Like, you can do it. You can do it. And then it made me realize, like, you're not that important. Like, nobody cares about as much about what you're doing as much as you think, right? And then when I was finally able to do that one push-up from my knees, Dr. K, it felt like I just climbed Mount Everest because I was proving to myself that I could do something that I never thought I could do. And that, I think, is right there is the importance of some of these small wins that seem so dumb in the moment to people, but you're proving to yourself that you can do something. And then that gave me the confidence to do 2 push-ups, 3 push-ups, 4 push-ups, all the way up until I was able to do a set of 10 and run a mile by the time my sentence was over. And it was like, here's another important lesson that I talk about, is that I think a lot of people think that self-confidence is built at the top of the mountain. I believe it's built like 0 to 1, 0 to 2. It's like, though, if people were to ask me now, despite all the success I've had personally and professionally, like what's been the most meaningful time in my life, it's my jail experience. It was my ability to go from the kid who hated himself, addicted to drugs, hopeless, felt worthless, couldn't even do a push-up or walk him down the steps, to being able to do that set of 10 and run a mile. Like that was the biggest confidence builder in my entire life.
Yeah, I agree. I think we even know that scientifically, where my experience as a clinician has been that confidence comes from surviving failure, not from success.
Right.
And I think in the example, and it's interesting because actually chain success leads to imposter syndrome. And so like, it's weird. Like the more, as I rose through the ranks of professional success, I saw more and more and more imposter syndrome. And I got confused because I was like, these are the most capable people.
Right.
Like I went to medical school at a place called Tufts University School of Medicine, which is like a decent medical school. And then I did my residency training at Harvard. And what shocked me was how much more imposter syndrome I saw at Harvard than at Tufts or the University of Texas, where I did undergrad. And it's like, we all sort of knew we were like kind of average.
Yeah.
And I even remember the first day of med school, they did a poll, which is like, why did you choose to come here? And the number one answer by like 75% of people were like, it was kind of like, I wasn't good enough to get into any of the best schools, but I wasn't so bad that I couldn't get in. So I kind of like picked it, and they picked me, and it was sort of like and so it's interesting that there's not a whole lot of imposter syndrome there.
That's wild.
It's crazy. And then I think the other thing that's so interesting, I mean, I want to highlight 2 or 3 things that you've said and maybe tie these points together. One is you mentioned self-awareness. Mm-hmm. And I think the interesting thing about hearing you, the push-up, is that I think when we struggle a lot, I think you're really good at highlighting how you constructed all of these ideas.
Yeah.
You constructed justifications, you constructed denials, you constructed victimization. And the thing is, those aren't false, right? That's what I think is so tricky, is that this is true. Like, objectively, you had, it's hard if you get divorced. Objectively, getting rid of anxiety and treating it with marijuana, treating your anxiety with some kind of substance is not a bad thing. I think the challenge, though, is that as we build up these ideas, I think you start to believe certain things about yourself. And what I'm really appreciating is the moment that you do something that you thought was impossible. Now that changes the whole game. Because I thought if I abandon drugs and I swim to the other shore, I'm not going to make it. That feels impossible. Recovering my life feels impossible. I see this all the time from people in our community. I'm 30 years old. Is it too late for me to start? And the funny thing is, it doesn't matter what the age is. People will say I'm 21 years old. Is it too late to start? People will say I'm 17 years old. Is it too late to start? If I screwed up my life, I'm 32. Then it doesn't matter what the age is.
Right.
And I think really somehow doing the impossible and shattering your own conceptions, which are all these like calcified, mutated things that you didn't, these are all weird adaptations that your mind makes.
I think the most interesting thing to me about all of that, at least looking back now and looking at it retrospectively, is like a lot of what I've talked about, like you see now in like the self-help space. And like, I literally, like, I just figured it out like in real time. Like I wasn't reading like books. I wasn't listening to podcasts. It was survival. Like the quote I often say that people really enjoy is the surround yourself with people who have common futures and not common pasts. That came because when I got out of jail and I got super passionate about health and fitness, I was obsessed with like reading. I was reading like Muscle and Fitness and Men's Health. And I was like passionate about learning how to cook for myself so that I could eat healthier. And then I still wanted to like have friends, because I was like, well, I've known these people for a long time. I don't want to just not have any friends. But what happened was I would sit there on the couch and they'd be like talking about going and getting high and all this stuff that I didn't want to do. And it felt awkward to me. And I remember I'm a pretty deep thinker. And I remember pondering that, like, why do I feel so disconnected to these people? And it's because it was like an awkward first date. Like I had nothing in common with them anymore. You know what I mean? Like there was nothing that I was doing that they were doing, nothing that they were doing that I was doing. And so it taught me like, all right, like just because I've known somebody for 10 years, or 15 years, doesn't mean I need to spend the rest of my life with them. And it was a really important lesson for me because the main reason I spent time with a lot of the people that I did when I was growing up was because I wanted attention. I didn't want to feel lonely, because I felt like if I didn't have anything to do on a weekend, that meant I was a loser. And I remember after that, I was living with my grandparents. Like I said, I would stay home by myself with my grandparents and watch cooking shows. And that's how I like helped learn how to teach myself how to cook and watch things like Dancing with the Stars. And it taught me to be comfortable being alone. And I often say, like, you feel way lonelier spending time with the wrong people than you ever will spending time by yourself in a way that's intentional. And it allowed me to develop a lot of self-awareness, because when you're alone, you think, man, at least I did. Like I think about my life, I think about what's going on. And I was able to kind of put together like kind of a rough idea of what I wanted over the next few months and few years.
Yeah, so that's interesting, Doug, because I've got a challenge for you as a subject matter expert. So I think, back when you and I did this, I think we were lucky in some ways, because I think the world was different.
Right.
Right now, I see 2 major challenges that like the people in our communities, or just I think entire generation of people are facing. The first thing is that socialization, socialization has been replaced by isolation.
Right.
So what I'm hearing is that, sure, you didn't connect with these people, but there's always like someone around, right? There's your grandparents, there's your cellmate. And you know, I found something similar when I went to the ashram. I was in a monastery in India for 3 months when I was 21. And that was quite transformative for me for very similar reasons. I hear so many of my experiences in your story, very different circumstances. Right. But that's why it's so interesting to hear what your experience of it was, because I think it was pretty similar. I'm not saying that I think an ashram is probably preferable to prison.
Right.
But so I'm curious because I think that now people have such a challenge to connect.
Right.
Right. You feel awkward, and then it's so much harder to go back. Since I feel awkward with people, I'm going to just DM people on Discord.
Right.
And so I'm curious, like, do you have, because I mean, you say you're a personal trainer, you've written a couple of books, but I have to think that you get emails from people reach out, people ask you questions. Do you have any kind of thoughts or guidance about how to tackle this like difficulty of loneliness and just stepping outside of because you're saying hang out with people that have common futures, not common pasts. Well, like, that's not easy to do. How do you do that? How do you find those people?
Well, I think, you know, the easy road, I think will end up costing most people like later on in life, right? I think, yeah, I mean, it does make sense when people are feeling lonely to go hang out with people that they really don't want to spend time with, or people that maybe aren't having a good impact in their lives. I mean, the hard thing is to develop the self-awareness that we've talked about and learn how to better understand yourself, which I know you talk about, and figure out like what it is you want in your life. And I know that's very, very difficult. So I'm not here to say that this is going to be like this easy fix. When it comes to that, the way and people ask me all the time, they ask me, hey, like you talk about like the importance of relationships, friendships. How do I make new friends? And this isn't like a one size fits all approach, but this to me makes the most sense, and it's worked for me. So once you identify like what you like in life, your values, your beliefs, where you want to go, who you are, etc., you're like, okay, where would I find more people like myself? So if I'm a person, let's just say I love health and fitness, I like personal development, like podcasting, etc., and I want to make new friends. I'm just using myself as an example. Where would I go? I'd go to a gym. I would talk to random people at the gym. I'd go to conferences. I would, go to networking events. I would go to a trail. I mean, I'm just throwing examples out of like where I would meet like-minded people.
Wait, so let me ask you something. Do you talk to people at the gym?
I mean, I'm not like actively going up and talking to people like all the time, but I'm saying if you go to the gym enough, you're talking to certain people you see, right?
Hold on. How does that happen? Can you walk us through a play-by-play?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, to be fair, now since my time is so limited and I am a personal trainer and a lot of people in the gym know that I'm a trainer and they'll ask me questions, full disclosure, I try not to talk to as many people because I'm trying to just get my workout in and leave, right? But my goal isn't to, I mean, I have a pretty solid group of friends now. I don't need to go in and meet new people. However, back in the day, I would just walk up to somebody and be like, hey, like, what are you working on today? And they would tell me like, oh, like, that's cool. Like, what's your favorite exercise to do? Like, and I would just ask them questions about themselves. I wouldn't go and talk about myself. I would just ask them questions about them because we all like talking about ourselves, right? Like, I'm here telling you my story. Or I would walk up to somebody and just say, hey, like, how long you been coming here? Like, what are your goals? And then that just kind of just sparks a conversation. Or, I mean, probably the lowest hanging fruit is to take a group fitness class, because now you're kind of forced to talk to people, right? In a way.
That's the answer I'm looking for.
Yeah. Where you're in with a group.
Yeah. So I think that's so it's because I think some of the stuff, Doug, that I think you and I take for granted. So like I grew up playing with kids on my street.
Yeah, me too.
And I think people don't grow up like that anymore. So right. The more I work with like people, the more I realize the stuff that you and I take for granted, despite all of our challenges. And my life was way easier than yours in 1,000 different ways. But despite all your challenges, we still have certain things that we take for granted, like walking up to someone. And I think that something has changed with digital communication. That's why the Surgeon General released this like report on isolation and loneliness, which is a huge problem. And I think people don't know, it's so anxiety provoking. Now there's also all these allegations of being a creep and stuff like that. So you can't like walk up to strangers.
Right.
And talk to them. One of the things that I do, and so I think group fitness classes is tops. Like I think that's like the answer for maybe 30 to 40% of people.
Right.
Because then then it's okay to talk to people. It's expected that you talk to people. And that triggers the whole social anxiety thing, which is a problem for a different day. But one of the things that I do so what I sort of found is I was like trying to experiment with this and trying to figure out, okay, like what can I do? And this is one thing that I found was pretty good is if I'm waiting for a machine, I'll walk up to someone and I'll say like, I'll ask them, I was like, how many sets do you have left?
Yeah.
Not trying to get in your, like, you'll ask them something that's directly related to the thing and gives me a reason to talk to them.
Right.
And then when they're done, I'll say thank you. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'll fist bump. Sometimes, and if it's the second time I've encountered them, because I go at the same time and I tend to see this in the same, then I'll introduce myself. And I find that that's like all you need. Like I feel weird asking people. It feels invasive to me to ask, like, what are you working on? Like, what are your goals, son?
Well, I mean, I think maybe it works. Like, I mean, I've had success with this, like a lot of making guy friends. I mean, if somebody's like trying to, I mean, I think a lot of, it's different if you're like trying, I guess, to pick up like somebody to date at a gym, not like saying this is just specifically for like trying to make friends and also just get good. It's like maybe these interactions lead you nowhere, but it's just to get good at walking up to people you don't know and talking to them. I think that's like the skill that's gotten lost in today's society. And like whether or not, whether or not people want to admit it or not, there's no app to fix that. Like you have to, the only way to improve that is to go up and do it, like, and it's tough. And I get it as somebody that I used to be so afraid to like talk to people that I didn't know. And because I was mortified of rejection and what they would think of me, or they think I'm a creep or whatever. The more I've gotten content with understanding that like me going up to a person I don't know and trying to spark a conversation is me betting on myself and proving to myself that I'm worthy enough of having that type of interaction. The more it's like allowed me to just talk to random people and just get good at people skills, because that like, that's the thing. Like, I mean, so like to the person who is feeling lonely, like you have to, let's just say you get introduced to 1 million people tomorrow. You still have to have people skills to develop relationships. You can't relationships aren't just built by you being around people. You have to learn how to talk to people. And so I always just tell people to like start asking some questions, simple questions, like, and the whole creep thing. I mean, I get it. I mean, I think that's been something that's grown more, I guess, in recent years with stuff. But, I mean, I always say like, if you're being creepy or not. Like, as long as you're not being I think if you're not being creepy, I think like it's on them, not you, right?
If you're being creepy. I don't think many people do. And
Right.
I think the challenge is actually, I would say that more people are afraid of being creepy in my experience. And this is a selection bias.
Sure.
More people are afraid of coming off creepier than they actually are. Right. So everyone's so paranoid about being a creep nowadays. They don't realize it's like not that creepy. But I think this is some of the challenges that we have is teaching, we have to somehow bridge this gap because something has changed.
Right.
And I love, I think if you're being creepy, but I think, like you said, you've had a large foundation of self-awareness. You've had a large foundation of, think about yourself when you were 16, right? You didn't know back then. I mean, you were full of anxiety, literally using marijuana in order to make friends. Like, that's the challenge that people have. And I see that the person you are today, I have no doubt in my mind that you can, I can see why you're a motivational speaker. You have a beautiful way with words. You have a lot of humble confidence. Like, you're not arrogant at all, but you know what you want and you're comfortable with it. You accept your flaws, you accept responsibility. Like, I think it makes sense.
I appreciate the kind words. I mean, and it's come a long way, and it's come from these failures and learning how to deal with the rejections. I mean, I did have remorse at times as a kid. I do want to point that out. Like, it's not like I was completely oblivious to my choices. Like when my mom was in the hospital again, I had the party, because when you're a kid, at least where I grew up, it's like when parents went away, the cool thing to do was throw a party.
Rager.
Yeah, Rager. There you go. Exactly. And my parents never went away. And so even if one of them went away, there was always the other one that was going to take care of us while the other one was away. Right. So my mom went in the hospital. And again, it was at a time where I was, on this path for excessive external validation and stuff, that I was like, I think it'll be a good idea to make up some story of where I'm actually going to stay and then have this party. I had the party, and my mom was having like this medical procedure. And I remember after she found out, like, I was embarrassed. I was so upset because I knew that what I had done was wrong. I knew that it was going to change my relationship with my mom. I knew that it was going to create more problems for me long term. I just didn't know how to reconcile all that. And I was so in such denial, and my ability to lie to myself and justify things, I became really good at it, that I could convince myself that it was okay in some way. And that happened with other things where, I would, if I stole something, or if I like ripped somebody off when I was selling them drugs, or if I lied or whatever I did, like there was always some level of remorse after the fact. Now, in the moment, no, like there was no way of harnessing or learning how to deal with delaying gratification. It was all like what I wanted in that moment. And now it's like that skill, I guess, of unlearning that has been very powerful in like my ability to create something like a podcast, which takes time, or to develop like relationships, which takes time, like to work on your, like all these things take time. Like there's no easy fix to build a podcast. There's no like quick checklist. There's no like, you can't build a romantic relationship in a day. You can't fix yourself in a day. It's just like, these things take time. And I knew that like me behaving in the way that I was behaving as a kid was not going to get me anywhere with any of these things. So, I mean, yeah, I just, a lot of these skills that I've learned came from trials and tribulations of acting like a moron when I was a kid.
Yeah. So I think it's love it, Doug. So, I mean, I think a couple things jump to my mind. One is that I think it's clear to me that, because here's the problem in my mind. The problem in my mind is that when I hear your story, I think it's a great story. I think you have a lot to offer. I think the problem is that there are a lot of people who are going to be listening to this, and they're going to say, but my circumstance is different, right? So this guy knows how to go up to people and talk to them. This guy went to jail. I've worked with so many people who long for rock bottom. It's almost like when you were describing this, like, 20, these rock stars who die at 27, it's like, it's almost the opposite of that. It's like, we've heard so many stories, right? Because this is the kind of stuff that gets you as a guest on a podcast, is you hit rock bottom and then you came back and you climbed ever. I couldn't do a single push-up, and now here I am. I showed this judge my picture of me on the health and fitness section. Blah, blah, blah. Right. And then but the problem is that so many people out there don't have those extreme circumstances. They don't have that.
Right.
And so what I'm hearing, and that's why I'm kind of pushing you a little bit here, because when I talk to these people, they're like, I wish I hit rock bottom. I wish I went to jail. I wish that it was, I know people who long for do or die. It's a weird kind of suicidality.
But why do you think they think that? Like, what do you think is going on in their mind where they're like, okay, like I know I need to make this change, but I can't. Like, what do you think it then is like going through their head? Yeah.
So I think you've laid it out, actually. So I think the first thing is that they know. That's the first thing. Like, you've always known. You just didn't listen to yourself.
Right.
You chose to ignore yourself. You chose to go in another direction. There are moments of time where we know what we should be doing.
Right.
Number two is, I think it's this is your answer. It's unwillingness. It's not that they don't know. It's not that their circumstances are unsolvable. Sometimes they feel that way. But I think deep down, I would say at least half of the people I work with, their primary problem is unwillingness. They're unwilling to pay the price. They're unwilling to take the chance. They're unwilling to leave one shore not knowing where the other shore is.
Right.
I think the third thing is I think that we have, like you were kind of saying, we didn't get a chance to really dig into this, but there's a lot of emotional numbing. And I think you make a strong case for how much that really hampers our growth.
Right.
We're so busy running away from feeling awkward. Whereas, like, if you think about it, you know, from a neuroscience perspective, an evolutionary perspective, shame, guilt, anxiety, these are not bugs. These are not pathologies. These are features. These are features which actually our brain prioritizes the most. So if you look at dementia, which is our brain is decaying, literally on the inside, our brain is turning into mush. We see volume reductions in the tissue of the brain. And what the human body preserves more than anything else is paranoia, is fear, is anger. This is why people who are demented will experience so much negative emotion, because this is actually what our brain values more than anything else. This is what keeps us alive. This is what drives us forward. And now we've created this weird situation in our society where if you kind of think about shame, shame only works in a tribal community. So when I'm ashamed of myself and I have to wake up the next day and go to school and see these people again every day after every day after every day, if I want to stop feeling ashamed, I have to make a change. So I'm forced. Shame is designed to force positive change. That's why it makes us feel so bad. It makes me feel bad. So what does the human being do? If I touch a hot pan and my hand burns, then I change my behavior to avoid the pain. That's why shame hurts so much. Right. Now the problem is that we can actually disarm shame with numbness, with Instagram, with memes, with isolation, with Discord. I can avoid all of those people. So then shame hurts, it pushes us away, and then we never make corrective change. So what I'm kind of hearing from you, and it's interesting because I see this like layered in. You had to do a push-up in front of those people at jail. You didn't have a fucking choice.
Right. There was no choice.
Right? And then you had to live with it the next day. That's what's changed. We have a society where we no longer have to live with the consequences of our choices. That's what drugs do. They allow us to not live with the consequences of our choices. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but I guess listening to that, and let's just say somebody is like, well, I'm not in jail. Like I'm not at rock bottom. Wouldn't the thing though for that person to think is that, okay, like he and others have clearly like shared like how to like get yourself to start feeling better about yourself. Like here's the things you should do. Like why wouldn't, like doesn't it come back then to that person's, again, like unwillingness, you mentioned this, to say, okay, I'm going to try something different and see where that leads. Like that's my thing, is like, yeah, like why not? My story is different than everybody else's, and people's circumstances are better and worse than mine. But if I'm sitting here telling you like that, you know, doing a single push-up and betting on myself and taking these like small wins really helped me transform my life, don't you think that would invite the person who maybe isn't at rock bottom to like be like, oh, like where can I implement that into my life? Well,
I think that's why you do the work that you do and I do the work that I do.
Right.
So I think I'm going to counter that and then I'll support it. So here's what I'm kind of, I think what happens when we hear that story, you hit rock bottom, then you met this cellmate, and then you turned your life around. So if we look at the moment, the inflection point from the decline to the rise, that is not a choice. That is a circumstance. This is why people that I work with long for that circumstance. They long for adversity. They're like, you know, I want to push myself to the limits. I would rather break or succeed.
Right.
I'm tired of this in the middle stuff. And they listen to your story and they listen to my story and they see these inflection points that are extreme circumstances. And then of course, okay, you had an inflection point, I had an inflection point. Look at where we were, look at where we are. And so naturally the human mind thinks this is what I need to. I think the real tragedy, though, is I think you're right, and I think that's how it works, right? Because I've helped a lot of people. I'm sure you've helped a lot of people, too, without hitting rock bottom. which is that I think that all rock bottom does is removes all of your excuses.
Right.
But you can remove your excuses on your own. A lot of people do it without hitting rock bottom. Their stories are just not nearly as sexy as ours.
Right. And I think, you make that, I mean, I loved how you made the comparison between choice and circumstance. I guess I don't want to say counter argument, because I agree with you. Like I do. And that's part of what, when I share my story, that's why I talk about being lucky, is because I was put in this situation, being in jail, where this guy who's since passed, he passed away a few years ago, came in to help me change my life, which is essentially, it happens, but it's not very common. But that got me started. But what kept me going was the habits. Like it was, right? So like so what I say is like, yes, the circumstance between what I have and somebody else is different, but the habits are the same.
So now I'll go even one step weirder, and I would say that the circumstance isn't even important. It's all habits, and it's all choice. And this may sound weird to people because here we are highlighting these circumstances. So here's the thing that like I just connected. So the circumstance actually doesn't matter, because let's just look at alternate scenarios. So if you had listened to your grandparents, if when these people said, okay, like you can move into our kid's room because they're away at college, the circumstance was right for you 10,000 times, right? Any of those points could have been, oh yeah, when my mom had a heart attack and went to the hospital and I threw a rager, that's when I realized, looking at my mom in the hospital bed, I need to turn things around. When I was homeless and these kind people gave me a place to stay, that's the moment I turned things around. Any one of those things could have been the point that turned around your life. The difference is your willingness. The difference is your awareness and your receptivity. And I think you're spot. I mean, I think that's why we both believe this, but it's kind of weird, right? Because that's not the story that we tell. And I think when I work with people, what I tend to find is that they have a lot of opportunities.
Right. And I think like where you come from, where I come from, it's obviously very similar, which is why I think we connect so well, but it's different in that you come from it from a medical perspective and from a psychiatric perspective, and somebody who's like seen it in like real time, and you're working with a lot of people that aren't at that willingness stage. Yeah. Or the people that I've coached, they're coming to me to hire me because they're willing to make a change. And I'm like, all right, when you're ready, I got the blueprint. I can tell you exactly what to do, and it'll get you to X place, right?
And even then, it's a bit silly, but I would even push back against that. I think that the presumption of your client's willingness is I think they're probably faking it a little bit till they make it.
Right.
And then I think that once you start giving them small wins, it kind of moves in the right direction. But I'm really starting to appreciate that, like, for all the people out there who haven't hit rock bottom, I think it's not rock bottom that creates the change. It's the awareness that creates the rock bottom, because that's as far down as you go. The moment that you become aware and the moment that you become receptive, it turns around. And since you turn it around there, that becomes your rock bottom. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
Well, it does, because I think the circumstance thing, I think, also makes sense, because on paper, like, was being in jail tough? I mean, yes, but I think the bigger health scare was me being, strapped down to a bed in an emergency room thinking that I was having a heart attack and dying. It was me being rushed. I mean, I got the same thing happened not too long after that, where I was rushed out in an ambulance thinking I was having a heart attack, and like, again, like having my vitals checked at 17, 18 years old, thinking that I was dying. Like that, like that's scary, right? That's like life in a way, like almost looking death in the face, because I thought I was literally dying. But yet I go to jail where I was more, I guess I was more insulated, and I wasn't having like a health scare in jail other than detoxing from the drugs. That was the other thing too I should mention, is that the detox, as you know, from opiate withdrawal is so gnarly that I was like, I never, ever, 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 ever want to feel like this again, because it was the most horrific thing. And it's like, it's not like you're sick for a day. It's like weeks when you're an idiot like me who did so much drugs. Like the withdrawal lasts like forever, it seemed like.
Yeah, it's wild. I've had one patient once told me that the worst part of cancer is withdrawing from opiates.
Oof.
Right, because that's when presumably the reason we made 80 milligram OxyContins or MS Contins or whatever is because of cancer pain. But
well, and I want to say the last thing on that is I'm really thankful that I wasn't that I'm not that I didn't have my addiction problems in today's world because of fentanyl. And I mean, I was a guy who I would do whatever. Like, I remember there was a time where a guy handed me a bag of like 10 80 milligram Oxycontin pills. He's like, hey, I'm not sure if any of these are real. 1 or 2 may be real. And I remember taking that bag and licking every time release off every single pill to see if I could taste the oxy, to see if I could get, a real one. And today, I mean, some of those could be laced with fentanyl. So I'm really thankful that I didn't grow up like in today's world, because it's just so much, it's way different. Like now, like, back in the day, I think people experimented with drugs a lot. Now you can't really do that because of the risk that's involved with it being potentially laced with fentanyl. So it's just a totally different world that I live in now compared to when I changed my life. So I also want to make that clear that, yeah, I get, like, social media wasn't that big of a deal when I was growing up. Like, it wasn't as in your face as it is today. Technology wasn't as big of a deal. The loneliness thing wasn't as big of a deal. So I get that today making that change is different, but I still think the same habits apply.
Yeah, I think that's what that's what I'm hunting for. So I've got like a goal, which is like, I think there's so much value to what you say. I think you're right, Doug. Yeah. And I mean, you say I come at it from a medical perspective, but that came later. I think the perspective feels identical to me. And then there's just an issue of mechanics, like what's going on under the hood, but the answers are the same.
Right.
And I think we have to take something about this and help people apply it, which I hopefully they can do now. I'm not quite sure what, but I think a lot of self-awareness, a lot of recognizing that, rock bottom is defined by the moment that you make a change, not a circumstance.
Right.
Because that's as low as you go. The moment you start moving in the other direction.
Because you don't really know what rock bottom is until you make that change. You're like, how do you know? Right.
Absolutely. And I think that's another challenge, right, is that a lot of people, just like you and just like me, we blamed our circumstances when we played the victim.
Right.
And we said, oh, like this. And then now there's a lot of science that tells us that we're victims, which is fair enough. I mean, we have to acknowledge the difficulties of divorce and parents who don't talk and all that kind of stuff. Totally. And at the same time, like, what are you going to do about it? Right. And I think that the real tragedy that I see more and more is that when people feel like their circumstances, I see this a lot when I work with people in abusive relationships, is that they think like, oh, like, their abuser is so powerful. Right. And that's true in a lot of ways. But the most powerful, the biggest thing that creates the power imbalance between someone who's the abuser in a relationship and someone who's the abused is the belief that the abuser has all of the power.
Right.
And so then it becomes really tricky as a psychiatrist between like walking this tightrope, and it's one of the hardest things that I've had to do, which is like, this isn't your fault, but you made some choices to get here.
Right.
And you can make some choices to leave.
Right.
And that's hard. And I think people run into that.
Well, yeah, and it's tough because, like, I think we live in these two extremes sometimes where it's like either everything's like your fault or everything's not your fault. And it's like it's somewhere in the middle, right? Like, I think, like, I mean, there's the quote, I think it's like Will Smith, where it's like, it's not your fault, but it's your responsibility. And I think that's where I tend to agree, is like, yeah, like the circumstances are not your fault, but it is like, if you want to better yourself, it's on you to fix it. Like, nobody's coming to save you. And I wanted all these things in my life to save me. In my younger years, I wanted the drugs and the attention from selling drugs and even my family, like all these things to save me. And then when I got out of jail, I wanted some of the other things that I talked about earlier to save me. And what I've realized is like just the work is hard, like, and, really internally validating yourself and being comfortable with who you are. It's a tough thing. And it's not to say that it's not achievable, because it certainly is, but it's if you're not careful, you can start to fall down that slippery path that I described earlier, where you're using healthy things to externally validate yourself, or things that are quote unquote legal, and you're not even realizing that you're doing them to escape, like, looking at who you truly are and asking yourself if you're actually happy with and fulfilled with where you're at in your life.
Yeah, I think it's well said. I know we've been at it for about a couple hours now, so I was wondering if you had any kind of like anything that we didn't talk about, anything that you want to mention or dig into more?
I mean, I think like the main thing that I mean, I guess I haven't really touched on that I think is important is my ability or the importance of like healing the relationship with my parents and why that helped me in my adult relationships. Because for the longest time with my mom, like she was, we had this kind of like unhealthy relationship because of the way that things transpired when I was younger. And it was like being able to like heal that relationship with her was like really meaningful for me because it taught me the importance of patience, that I had to like work on myself, develop trust in myself to be able to prove that she could trust me again. And then I also knew that like if I had a good solid relationship with her, that was only going to make other adult relationships that I had better in the long run. The same thing with my dad. So I think that was like an important thing that I wanted to make sure I touch on, was that played like a very valuable role in my life. Because before, like when I first got into the personal development space, it was like, all right, like if people like wronged you in your life, they're bad people. And it was like, no, like I had to look at like why this all transpired and how it's impacting me now as an adult, and be able to learn to forgive and accept and have healthy conversations. Because growing up, like I avoided conflict a lot. So I had to learn like, okay, if I want to have better relationships, I need to learn how to navigate conflict and talk to people that I'm upset with or I don't agree with. And that like a lot of that came from healing with my relationship with my parents. The other thing I wanted to really make sure we covered is the thing with my cellmate, because this question gets asked to me every podcast I do. What happened to your cellmate? My cellmate ended up passing away a few years ago, and it was like one of the most painful moments of my life for obvious reasons. And him and I, when I got out of jail, I stayed in touch with him. We ended up meeting up several times and did some workouts together. But then he ended up kind of going down a different path than I did. I'll just leave it at that. But the crazy thing about this and the total full circle moment is that, I've been going on podcasts and sharing my story for a long time, and I didn't understand. I would just I come on here because, like I said, I want to provide value to your audience. I love chatting with people like you, and I want to help people. But what happened was when he passed away, I got messages from people in his family being like, hey, like, I just listened to your podcast episode on so-and-so's podcast. Like, thank you so much for talking about Eric and the way that you talked about, because it reminded me of who he was. And I would get messages like that, and it really meant something because I had no idea the downstream effects and impacts that that sharing my story and sharing my experience in jail would have. Like I didn't know how it was all going to play out, and then I ended up speaking at his funeral. Wow. And like being able to tell the story, in real time to his family and his friends, because his family like knew who I was because I think he had talked about him. But yeah, I mean it's a pretty powerful thing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's sad, but I think as you know, it's challenging, right? And we can have those moments of being who we really are and connected to ourselves. And we haven't talked about your sobriety for 15 years, but one of the things I've learned is you can basically almost never take sobriety for granted.
Right.
Our demons still haunt us, and it's not like things get fixed. I think that things can get a lot better. They can get a lot stable, but my experience has largely been that you have to be vigilant. Right. And thank you so much because I think everyone is curious, like, what happened to him.
Yeah.
And it sounds sad, but it also sounds like it sounds very bittersweet to me.
Very bittersweet, because I often wondered, like, why did he pick me? Like, why did he pick me before saving his own life? Like, what was it about me? Like, I wasn't like this. I wasn't like the nicest kid. I was very shut down. I was very emotionally unavailable. I wasn't like out there being like, help me, help me, help me. I just happened to be sitting there playing Scrabble. He was playing Scrabble with me. But yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed like chatting with you, because it opens my eyes and it helps me see things from a different lens too, because I am biased based on my story and where I came from. And also like a lot of the stuff that I've learned, like I have my own view on what I think works. And I know we agree on like most everything, but I'm happy that you point out like some of the things that maybe I don't see, and like how your audience might see things and be like, well, what do I do? And it's not as simple as me being like, well, go outside and work out. Like there's many more layers to that.
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge that I see now is that the things that we think are simple have somehow become hard.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so hard to apply what we talk about. At the same time, I think it's doable. It's just another problem to be solved. Things change. Not everyone's life is the same. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask you. So you said that you've written 3 books.
Yes.
And so I know you've got a podcast, The Adversity Advantage, which everyone should check out, and we'll link to that. I don't know if I think that you can just search on YouTube or whatever for it, or Spotify, I imagine.
Yeah, if you just search my name,
Yeah.
Doug Bopst on all social platforms, and YouTube, it's you just search me on Doug Bopst, where the podcast is held, and other all the other podcast platforms as well.
And is that what you would like if people want to learn more? Is that what you would recommend? Do you want to tell us a little bit about these like books you've written? Because I find myself being curious about those.
Yeah, I've written 3 books, and I think the books I've written were all they were all written based on like a reflection of the place that I was at that time in my life. So my first book was From Felony to Fitness to Free, which I wrote like right after the felony came off my record to share my story and inspire people to turn a negative into a positive. The second book I wrote was called Faith, Family, Fitness, which goes into my story of becoming a Christian. And like that's an interesting story in itself, because I hated God. I hated anything that revolved around religion, because I grew up old school religious, and I knew it was like, if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. And I was like, well, I'm on the highway to hell. So like, what's all this matter? And during that time where I thought that the healthy external validation stuff would fix my problems, and it didn't, I had to go on this deeper search for meaning. And that's when I developed a spiritual relationship. I don't consider myself to be religious. I'm not like dogmatic about it. I mean, I believe in Jesus and God, but I'm not like somebody who, it's all about like a relationship for me. And then so I wrote this book about that. And then I provided like 15 of the top lessons that I had learned at that point in my life. And then the third book I wrote was called The Heart of Recovery, where I interviewed 50 different people from all walks of life on how they've overcome and beat drug addiction in different paths too. Like I believe in all paths. Like if it works for you, like do it. Like my path to recovery might look different from somebody else's, from another person's. Like, I mean, we all have like our unique path, and you have to find what works for you. So, it goes into people's paths and how they did it. And there's common themes, because I remember when I first got into recovery, like I didn't go into AA or NA. So I wasn't like a 12-step person. I wasn't somebody that talked about sobriety. I just was like, all right, if I'm not using the drugs that I'm abusing, like that's all I need to do. Right. But I saw that there was a lot of people that were just kept relapsing and relapsing and relapsing. I was like, why? Like, how come I've been able to not go to treatment or not go to, and again, my story is unique, but how have I been able to do it?
Can I jump in there? Sorry, I it's really interesting, but what we know is scientifically, the majority of people do it your way. They actually don't do 12-step or even don't seek psychiatric care. People figure it out. That's the most common.
Well, yeah, and so I developed 5 questions that I thought were paramount for my recovery, and that were, like, what do I do on a daily basis to abstain from like the drugs that I was abusing? Who do I spend the most time with? What's my workout routine look like? What's my spiritual relationship look like? And like that rock bottom moment that developed that emotional connection to where you never want to be like that person again. So I interviewed all these people and put that all into a book. They were all self-published. I'm actually in the midst now of working on a more in-depth book about my story. I'm working with an agent on that. So hopefully that should come out sometime in the next few years or so. But yeah, the podcast, I would say, is definitely the main mechanism for growth that I think people can look into. I invite people to check out the cannabis series, where I interviewed like the deputy director of NIDA. I interviewed Dr. Anna Lemke from Stanford. I interviewed Dr. John Crystal, who's the head of psychiatry at Yale. I mean, I interviewed a bunch of different experts in the field, because I wanted to understand, like, why has cannabis, specifically THC, I guess from what I've seen, become more dangerous than it was 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
Right. But then I also encourage people to check out the interview I did with you and all these other experts and amazing stories that are on the show. And again, just search my name on YouTube or The Adversity Advantage on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll find it.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming today, Doug. Thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties. And most importantly, thank you for like humoring us and my interruptions and giving us some of that. It's amazing the way that you talk about things and the way you share your experience. I think it really resonated a lot with me. My hope and my guess is that it resonated a lot because it's like, it's weird, right? We talk about addictions like they're bad things.
Yeah.
But when you really hear about what people are going through, like everyone who doesn't understand addiction looks at this and scratches their head and says, why does this person do this?
Right.
But then the more that I listen to like people's experiences of that moment, I'm making $5 an hour. It's a waste of a day to go to. I mean, I remember my first job was like marble slab serving ice cream for, I think, $4.25 an hour.
Wow.
And I would go and it would be like a waste of a day.
Yeah. That's crazy. Well, I guess I wanted to say too, like, I love that you challenge me. Like, I love, like, you and I were talking that, you sometimes get asked the same questions on interviews and I was asking you different stuff. This was very different for me, which I love because it's like not the typical, like, all right, tell me your story from start to finish. Tell me the jail story. We covered it, but I'm glad that you pushed me a little bit. And I'm glad that you did, frankly, interrupt me to learn more and poke at like where I needed to like talk more in depth to provide more value for your audience. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate your tolerance of the interruptions.
That's all good, man.
So thank you so much, Doug. I strongly recommend y'all check out the Adversity Advantage. Like, I know it sounds weird, but check out maybe the cannabis series, and y'all don't have to watch the interview with me if you guys are familiar with the channel and stuff. Like, maybe it'll be useful for y'all, but I'd strongly recommend y'all check out the other stuff. And thank you so much, Doug, for coming. And I think the last thing that I want to say is I do think there are a couple of threads here that I personally would love to learn about. Like you mentioned family and relationships, you mentioned spirituality. And so I find myself having more questions about you and your life and your journey and different perspectives that I think we don't talk about enough. So there's more left to say. So thank you so much for coming. You got it, man. Thanks again. Take care. All right. So we're going to go here. I'm going to do this. Okay. So I loved talking to Doug. Like I said, I mean, I get invited to a lot of podcasts. We go on different podcasts and things like that. And all of them are awesome in their own way. But I think that, see, Doug has been through it, and he also has a great like self-awareness to where, like, when I ask some of these questions, it's just clear to me that his questions come from a place of like self-awareness and stuff like that. And I don't know about y'all, maybe you guys would have preferred it if I stopped interrupting him, but I think it's like we talk about all these success stories, or about like, then I did this, and then I did weed, and then I did cocaine, and then I went to jail, and then I turned my life around. I met my cellmate and I did a push-up, and it's like, oh, right. And even when people like to ask me, right. So I've got my story, which is, it's all true, but we don't talk about we don't talk about, oh yeah, like I liked this girl in high school and she didn't give me the time of day. And that's when I started gaming a lot. Right. We don't talk about like the seedy underbelly of what these experiences are like. And I think that, like, I heard his answers, and in the back of my mind, my internal reaction is actually y'all. My internal reaction is, but wait a second, what do you mean you just go up and start talking to people? Right? The assumptions that we make on the path to recovery, progression, putting our lives together, like, we make all of these assumptions that I don't think we can take for granted anymore. That's part of the reason why I think the world is moving in the direction that it was. Like, this is why, like, these things used to work. They used to work. Something has changed. It's not working anymore. And I'm not trying to be alarmist, right? I'm not trying to get clipped and shipped. I'm saying, like, literally, we have like a U.S. Surgeon General who released a report on isolation and loneliness. This isn't smoking. It's not lung cancer. This is isolation and loneliness. And I mean, hell, like, it's so interesting to think, I never thought about it this way, but I like literally wrote a book. I spent a lot of time and energy writing a book, How to Raise a Healthy Gamer. And then, it's so interesting because Doug talks about his parents and he's like said, like, hey, I accept responsibility. I do not blame them for their circumstances. They did the best that they could. And the last thing is he shared one thing. So one time his mom asks him, what could I have done differently? And his answer is, ask me why. And it clicked for me in that moment. That is what the book is about. Because all these parents get confused. They're like, when do they stop playing video games? And I'm like, not for 60 days. They don't stop playing video games for a long time. How do I get them to stop? It's the wrong direction. You need to be asking why. It's a book about communication. Right? And I would bet money, like, I know in my case, and I don't know if y'all are struggling, but like, I know in my case, like, my parents never asked me why. Is I got F after F after F. It was not ever like, what's going on, man? Why are you doing this? What are you, like, no one ever asked. It was always, this is what's right, and this is what's wrong, and this is what you should be doing more of, and this is what you should be doing less of. It is direction and control, never inquiry, never understanding. And the real tragedy there is that, see, asking why is not about your parents' understanding. When you ask someone why and the words come out of their mouth, it is the person who speaks who understands more. In therapy, so this is really confusing for a lot of people, right? What do we do in therapy? We don't give people answers in therapy. Sometimes patients are very disappointed because we don't give answers in therapy. We ask questions. Sometimes we give answers. The purpose of asking questions is so that you have to think of an answer, and then as the answer comes out, your mind literally has to put the pieces of the puzzle together in order to articulate. The process, the neurological process of thought to articulation requires organization and tempering of thoughts. So it was wild to really think about it, but I was like, oh yeah, that's why I wrote that book. Because we need to be asking each other why. And then the last thing to consider is that asking why, you may wonder, why don't parents ask why? My parents didn't ask why. Doug's parents didn't ask why. There's a good chance that your parents didn't ask why. Or if they did ask why, they judged your answer. They weren't listening. And I see this a lot, especially when I have some friends who are in India. Holy crap, I don't know what's going on outside, but that's insane. We may have to stop because I don't know what's happening. But anyway, so this is something that I've seen more with Indian people, is that sometimes now Indian parents, and I'm sure this applies to Pakistani parents and Korean parents and whatever, they'll ask why, but they're not really listening. They're judging. Why do you do this? Why can't you stop? Right? It's crazy. And so I really think that we need to learn how to listen better. And that's what it's weird. It's like, why don't I write a book about 1,000 other things? Like, I don't know, video game addiction for y'all, technology addiction. Like, why don't I write that? And that's all coming. Give it time. But it's because parents need to learn how to ask why to ask why. And if y'all have someone who's struggling in your life, the way to communicate with them is different. It is not what our default mode of communication is. Anyway, so it was just interesting to hear him say, that is his answer, because it resonates so deeply. Not just adults, you're right. And someone saying, yeah, parents don't ask questions, they just assume. Yeah, that's the problem, right? Anyway, y'all, thank y'all for coming today. I sincerely hope that y'all enjoyed this. I sincerely hope that it was helpful to you. I hope. And even if it wasn't, fair enough. But I pushed him. Because this is the complaint of everyone's like, oh, just do this. No, hold on. We don't know how to just go up and talk to people at the gym. right? It's like, oh, like, what about approaching women? It's like, do I want to be a creep or do I want to be alone? It's like, those are our two choices. So I know that a lot of people, and I don't know, I also don't know if this resonates with y'all, but this is kind of more people that I work with, and I suspect this is a lot of y'all, that y'all would rather, you know, either make it or break it. You know, I one time had a patient who was telling me, like, you know, someone approached them and was like, okay, like in this hypothetical situation, there's two pills. One of them gives you $5 million and one of them kills you. Would you take it? Would you take one? And they're like, why not? It's a win-win. Right? Either I get to live with $5 million or I'm dead. Win-win. Why wouldn't I take it? And I think we don't say it, but that's oftentimes our experience, right? We're tired of the humdrum, like, every day, whatever. But I want y'all to take away, really think about this. I'm going to be spending some time thinking about it, right? So what makes rock bottom? Rock bottom is not a circumstance, because he had 1,000 opportunities for a rock bottom. I had 1,000 opportunities for rock bottom. Y'all have 1,000 opportunities for rock bottom. What makes rock bottom is your responsiveness to the circumstance and you're willing to change. What makes rock bottom is when you start moving up. So y'all think about that. And, like, let me know. Right? This is just an idea that I have. Now the question is, for each and every one of you who's struggling and you're thinking, oh, this circumstance, what can you do? Give it a shot. And he talked about small wins. I made a note about that. I'm going to make a lecture about it. Okay? All right. Thank y'all very much for coming today. Happy Friday, and we'll see y'all next week. We're going to be streaming with Dr. Mark Comrade, who is going to be talking to us about how to convince, and I don't know if convince is the right word, but how to help a loved one or someone that you care about get mental health support. All right? Thank y'all very much. We'll see y'all next week. If y'all are interested, we've got 2 good memberships lectures coming up, one on emotions 201 or 102. We're internally confused about which one it is. And a deep dive into intuition. So take care, everybody.